A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 30. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 30. Vassal unto Love. Elfride clung closer to Knight as day succeeded day. Whatever else might admit of question, there could be no dispute that the allegiance she bore him absorbed her whole soul and existence. A greater than Stephen had arisen, and she had left all to follow him. The unreserved girl was never chary of letting her lover discover how much she admired him. She never once held an idea in opposition to any one of his, or insisted on any point with him, or showed any independence, or held her own on any subject. His lightest whim she respected and obeyed as law, and if, expressing her opinion on a matter, he took up the subject and differed from her, she instantly threw down her own opinion as wrong and untenable. Even her ambiguities and espiègleries were but media of the same manifestation. Acted charades, embodying the words of her prototype, the tender and susceptible daughter-in-law of Naomi. Let me find favour in thy sight, my lord, for that thou hast comforted me, and for that thou hast spoken friendly unto thine handmaid. She was syringing the plants one wet day in the greenhouse. Knight was sitting under a great passion-flower observing the scene. Sometimes he looked out at the rain from the sky, and then at Elfride's inner rain of larger drops, which fell from trees and shrubs, after having previously hung from the twigs like small silver fruit. 'I must give you something to make you think of me during this autumn at your chambers,' she was saying. 'What shall it be? Portraits do more harm than good, by selecting the worst expression of which your face is capable. Hair is unlucky, and you don't like jewellery. Something which shall bring back my mind to the many scenes we have enacted in this conservatory. I see what I should prize very much, that dwarf myrtle tree in the pot, which you have been so carefully tending.' Elfride looked thoughtfully at the myrtle. 'I can carry it comfortably in my hat box,' said Knight, 'and I will put it in my window, and so, it always being before my eyes, I shall think of you continually.' It so happened that the myrtle which Knight had singled out had a peculiar beginning and history. It had originally been a twig worn in Stephen Smith's buttonhole, and he had taken it thence, stuck it into the pot, and told her that if it grew she was to take care of it and keep it in remembrance of him when he was far away. She looked wistfully at the plant, and the sense of fairness to Smith's memory caused her a pang of regret that Knight should have asked for that very one. It seemed exceeding a common heartlessness to let it go. 'Is there not anything you like better?' she said sadly. 'It is only an ordinary myrtle.' 'No, I am fond of myrtle.' Seeing that she did not take kindly to the idea, he said again, 'Why do you object to me having that?' 'Oh no, I don't object precisely. It was a feeling. Ah, here's another cutting lately struck, and just as small, of a better kind, and with prettier leaves. Myrtus microphylla.' 'That will do nicely. Let it be put in my room, that I may not forget it. What romance attaches to the other?' 'It was a gift to me.' The subject then dropped. Knight thought no more of the matter, till on entering his bedroom in the evening he found the second myrtle placed upon his dressing table as he had directed. He stood for a moment admiring the fresh appearance of the leaves by candlelight, and then he thought of the transaction of the day. Male lovers as well as female can be spoilt by too much kindness, and Elfride's uniform submissiveness had given Knight a rather exacting manner at crises, attached to her as he was. 'Why should she have refused the first one I chose?' he now asked himself. Even such a slight opposition as she had shown then was exceptional enough to make itself noticeable. He was not vexed with her in the least. The mere variation of her way to day from her usual ways kept him musing on the subject. because it perplexed him. It was a gift. Those were her words. Admitting it to be a gift, he thought she could hardly value a mere friend more than she valued him as a lover, and giving the plant to his charge would have made no difference. Except, indeed, it was the gift of a lover, he murmured. I wonder if Elfride has ever had a lover before, he said aloud, as a new idea quite. This and companion thoughts were enough to occupy him completely till he fell asleep rather later than usual. The next day, when they were again alone, he said to her rather suddenly, Do you love me more or less, Elfride, for what I told you on board the steamer? You told me so many things, she returned, lifting her eyes to his and smiling. I mean the confession you coaxed out of me, that I had never been in the position of lover before. It is a satisfaction, I suppose, to be the first in your heart, she said to him, with an attempt to continue her smiling. I am going to ask you a question now, said Knight somewhat awkwardly. I only ask it in a whimsical way, you know, not with great seriousness, Elfride. You may think it odd, perhaps. Elfride tried desperately to keep the colour in her face. She could not, though distressed to think that getting pale showed consciousness of deeper guilt than merely getting red. Oh, no, I shall not think that, she said, because it's obliged to say something to fill the pause which followed her questioner's remark. It is this. Have you ever had a lover? I am almost sure you have not, but have you? Not, as it were, a lover. I mean, not worth mentioning, Harry, she faltered. Knight, overstrained in sentiment, as he knew the feeling to be, felt some sickness of heart. Still, he was a lover. Well, a sort of lover, I suppose, she responded tardily. A man, I mean, you know. Yes, but a mere person, and... But truly your lover? Yes, a lover, certainly, he was that. Yes, he might have been called my lover. Knight said nothing to this for a minute or more, and kept silent time with his finger to the tick of the old library clock, in which room the colloquy was going on. You don't mind, Harry, do you? She said anxiously, nestling close to him and watching his face. Of course I don't seriously mind. In reason, a man cannot object to such a trifle. I only thought you hadn't, that was all. However, one ray was abstracted from the glory about her head. But afterwards, when Knight was wandering by himself over the bare and breezy hills, and meditating on the subject, that ray suddenly returned. For she might have had a lover, and never have cared in the least for him. She might have used the word improperly, and meant admirer all the time. Of course she had been admired, and one man might have made his admiration more prominent than that of the rest, a very natural case. They were sitting on one of the garden seats when he found occasion to put the supposition to the test. Did you love that lover or admirer of yours ever so little, Elfie? She murmured reluctantly, Yes, I think I did. Knight felt the same faint touch of misery. Only a very little, he said. I am not sure how much. But you are sure, darling, you loved him a little? I think I am sure I loved him a little. And not a great deal, Elfie? My love was not supported by reverence for his powers. But, Elfride, did you love him deeply? Said Knight restlessly. I don't exactly know how deep you mean by deeply. That's nonsense. You misapprehend, and you have let go of my hand, she cried, her eyes filling with tears. Harry, don't be severe with me, and don't question me. I did not love him as I do you, and could it be deeply if I did not think him cleverer than myself? For I did not. You grieve me so much you can't think. I will not say another word about it. And you will not think about it either, will you? I know you think of weaknesses in me after I am out of your sight, and not knowing what they are, I cannot combat them. I almost wish you were of grosser nature, Harry, I do in truth. Or rather, I wish I could have the advantages such a nature in you would afford me, and yet have you as you are.
What advantages would they be?
Less anxiety and more security. Ordinary men are not so delicate in their tastes as you, and where the lover or husband is not fastidious and refined and of deep nature, things seem to go on better, I fancy, as far as I have been able to observe in the world.
Yes, I suppose it is right. Shallowness has this advantage, that you can't be drowned there.
But I think I'll have you as you are. Yes, I will, she said winsomely. The practical husbands and wives who take things philosophically are very humdrum, are they not? Yes, it would kill me quite. You please me best as you are.
Even though I wish you had never cared for one before me?
Yes, and you must not wish it. Don't.
I'll try not to, Elfride. So she hoped, but her heart was troubled.
If he felt so deeply on this point, what would he say did he know all, and see it as Mrs. Jethway saw it? He would never make her the happiest girl in the world by taking her to be his own for aye. The thought enclosed her as a tomb whenever it presented itself to her perturbed brain. She tried to believe that Mrs. Jethway would never do her such a cruel wrong as to increase the bad appearance of her folly by innuendos, and concluded that concealment having been begun must be persisted in if possible. For what he might consider as bad as the fact was her previous concealment of it by strategy. But Elfride knew Mrs. Jethway to be her enemy and to hate her. It was possible she would do her worst, and should she do it, all might be over. Would a woman listen to reason and be persuaded not to ruin one who had never intentionally harmed her? It was night in the valley between Endelstow Crags and the shore. The brook which trickled that way to the sea was distinct in its murmurs now, and over the line of its course there began to hang a white riband of fog. Against the sky, on the left hand of the vale, the black form of the church could be seen. On the other rose hazel bushes, a few trees, and where these were absent, furze tufts, as tall as men, on stems nearly as stout as timber. The shriek of some bird was occasionally heard as it flew terror-stricken from its first roost to seek a new sleeping place where it might pass the night unmolested. In the evening shade, some way down the valley, and under a row of scrubby oaks, a cottage could still be discerned. It stood absolutely alone. The house was rather large, and the windows of some of the rooms were nailed up with boards on the outside, which gave a particularly deserted appearance to the whole erection. From the front door an irregular series of rough and misshapen steps, cut in the solid rock, led down to the edge of the streamlet, which at their extremity was hollowed into a basin through which the water trickled. This was evidently the means of water supply to the dweller or dwellers in this cottage. A light footstep was heard ascending from the higher slopes of the hillside. Indistinct in the pathway appeared a moving female shape, who advanced and knocked timidly at the door. No answer being returned, the knock was repeated with the same result, and it was then repeated a third time. This was also unsuccessful. From one of the only two windows on the ground floor which were not boarded up came rays of light, no shutter or curtain obscuring the room from the eyes of a passer-by on the outside. So few walked that way after nightfall that any such means to secure secrecy were probably deemed unnecessary. The inequality of the rays falling upon the trees outside told that the light had its origin from a flickering fire only. The visitor, after the third knocking, stepped a little to the left in order to gain a view of the interior, and threw back the hood from her face. The dancing yellow sheen revealed the fair and anxious countenance of Elfride. Inside the house this firelight was enough to illuminate the room distinctly, and to show that the furniture of the cottage was superior to what might have been expected from so unpromising an exterior. It also showed to Elfride that the room was empty. Beyond the light quiver and flap of the flames, nothing moved or was audible therein. She turned the handle and entered, throwing off the cloak which enveloped her, under which she appeared without hat or bonnet, and in the sort of half toilette country people ordinarily dine in. Then, advancing to the foot of the staircase, she called distinctly, but somewhat fearfully, "Mrs. Jethway?" No answer. With a look of relief and regret combined, denoting that ease came to the heart and disappointment to the brain, Elfride paused for several minutes, as if undecided how to act. Determining to wait, she sat down on a chair. The minutes drew on, and after sitting on the thorns of impatience for half an hour, she searched her pocket, took therefrom a letter, and tore off the blank leaf. Then, taking out a pencil, she wrote upon the paper: "Dear Mrs. Jethway, I have been to visit you. I wanted much to see you, but I cannot wait any longer. I came to beg you not to execute the threats you have repeated to me. Do not, I beseech you, Mrs. Jethway, let any one know I ran away from home. It would ruin me with him, and break my heart. I will do anything for you if you will be kind to me. In the name of our common womanhood, do not, I implore you, make a scandal of me. Yours, E. Swancourt." She folded the note cornerwise, directed it, and placed it on the table. Then, again drawing the hood over her curly head, she emerged silently as she had come. Whilst this episode had been in action at Mrs. Jethway's cottage, Knight had gone from the dining room to the drawing room, and found Mrs. Swancourt alone there. "Elfride has vanished upstairs or somewhere," she said, "and I have been reading an article in an old number of The Present that I lighted upon by chance a short time ago. It is an article you once told us was yours. Well, Harry, with due deference to your literary powers, allow me to say that this effusion is all nonsense, in my opinion." "What is it about?" said Knight, taking up the paper and reading. "There, don't get all red about it. Own that experience has taught you to be more charitable." "I have never read such chivalrous statements in my life." "From a man, I mean. There, I forgive you. It was before you knew Elfride." "Oh yes," said Knight, looking up. "I remember now. The text of that sermon was not my own at all, but was suggested to me by a young man named Smith, the same whom I have mentioned to you as coming from this parish. I thought the idea rather ingenious at the time, and enlarged it to the weight of a few guineas, because I had nothing else in my head." "Which idea do you call the text? I am curious to know that." "Well, this," said Knight, somewhat unwillingly, "that experience teaches, and your sweetheart, no less than your tailor, is necessarily very imperfect in her duties, if you are her first patron; and conversely, the sweetheart who is graceful under the initial kiss must be supposed to have had some practice in the trade." "And do you mean to say that you wrote that upon the strength of another man's remark, without having tested it by practice?" "Yes, indeed I do." "Then I think it was uncalled for and unfair. And how do you know it is true? I expect you regret it now." "Since you bring me into a serious mood, I will speak candidly. I do believe that remark to be perfectly true, and having written it, I will defend it anywhere. But I do often regret having ever written it, as well as others of the sort. I have grown older since, and I find such a tone of writing is calculated to do harm in the world. Every literary jack becomes a gentleman if he can only pen a few indifferent satires upon womankind. Women themselves, too, have taken to the trick, and so, upon the whole, I begin to be rather ashamed of my companions." "Ah, Henry, you have fallen in love since, and it makes a difference," said Mrs. Swancourt, with a faint tone of banter. "That's true, but that is not my reason." "Having found that, in a case of your own experience, a so-called goose was a swan, it seems absurd to deny such a possibility in other men's experiences." "You can hit palpably, cousin Charlotte," said Knight. "You are like the boy who puts a stone inside his snowball, and I shall play with you no longer. Excuse me, I am going for my evening stroll." Though Knight had spoken jestingly, this incident and conversation had caused him a sudden depression, coming rather singularly just after his discovery that Elfride had known what it was to love warmly before she had known him. His mind dwelt upon the subject, and the familiar pipe he smoked whilst pacing up and down the shrubbery path failed to be a solace. He thought again of those idle words, hitherto quite forgotten, about the first kiss of a girl, and the theory seemed more than reasonable. Of course, their sting now lay in their bearing on Elfride. Elfride, under Knight's kiss, had certainly been a very different woman from herself under Stephen's. Whether for good or ill, she had marvellously well learnt a betrothed lady's part, and the fascinating finish of her deportment in this second campaign did probably arise from her unreserved encouragement of Stephen. Knight, with all the rapidity of jealous sensitiveness, pounced upon some words she had inadvertently let fall about an earring, which he had only partially understood at the time. It was during that initial kiss by the waterfall. 'We must be careful. I lost the other by doing this.' A flush, which had in it as much of wounded pride as of sorrow, passed over Knight as he thought of what he had so frequently said to her in his simplicity. 'I always meant to be the first comer in a woman's heart, fresh lips or none for me.' How childishly blind he must have seemed to this mere girl! How she must have laughed at him inwardly! He absolutely writhed as he thought of the confession she had wrung from him on the boat in the darkness of night. The one conception which had sustained his dignity when drawn out of his shell on that occasion, that of her charming ignorance of all such matters, how absurd it was! This man, whose imagination had been fed up to preternatural size by the lonely study and silent observations of his kind, whose emotions had been drawn out long and delicate by his seclusion, like plants in a cellar, was now absolutely in pain. Moreover, several years of poetic study, and, if the truth must be told, poetic efforts, had tended to develop the affective side of his constitution still further, in proportion to his active faculties. It was his belief in the absolute newness of blandishment to Elfride which had constituted her primary charm. He began to think it was as hard to be the earliest in a woman's heart as it was to be the first in the pool of Bethesda. That Knight should have been thus constituted, that Elfride's second lover should not have been one of the great mass of bustling mankind, little given to introspection, whose good nature might have compensated for any lack of appreciativeness, was the chance of things. That her throbbing, self-confounding, indiscreet heart should have to defend itself unaided against the keen scrutiny and logical power which Knight, now that his suspicions were awakened, would sooner or later be sure to exercise against her, was her misfortune. A miserable incongruity was apparent in the circumstance of a strong mind practising its unerring archery upon a heart which the owner of that mind loved better than his own. Elfride's docile devotion to Knight was now its own enemy. Clinging to him so dependently, she taught him in time to presume upon that devotion, a lesson men are not slow to learn. A slight rebelliousness occasionally would have done him no harm, and would have been a world of advantage to her. But she idolized him, and was proud to be his bond servant. End of chapter 30. A Pair of Blue Eyes, chapter 31. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 31. A worm i' the bud. One day the reviewer said, "Let us go to the cliffs again, Elfride," and, without consulting her wishes, he moved as if to start at once. "The cliff of our dreadful adventure?" she inquired with a shudder. "Death stares me in the face in the person of that cliff." Nevertheless, so entirely had she sunk her individuality in his, that the remark was not uttered as an expostulation, and she immediately prepared to accompany him. "No, not that place," said Knight.
It is ghastly to me too. That other, I mean, what is its name? Windy Beak. Windy Beak was the second cliff in height along the coast, and, as is frequently the case with the natural features of the globe, no less than with the intellectual features of men, it enjoyed the reputation of being the first. Moreover, it was the cliff to which Elfride had ridden with Stephen Smith on a well-remembered morning of his summer visit. So, though the thought of the former cliff had caused her to shudder at the perils to which her lover and herself had there been exposed, by being associated with night only it was not so objectionable as Windy Beak. That place was worse than gloomy. It was a perpetual reproach to her. But not liking to refuse, she said, "It is further than the other cliff." "Yes, but you can ride." "And will you too?" "No, I'll walk." A duplicate of her original arrangement with Stephen. Some fatality must be hanging over her head. But she ceased objecting. "Very well, Harry, I'll ride," she said meekly. A quarter of an hour later she was in the saddle. But how different the mood from that of the former time! She had indeed given up her position as queen of the less to be the vassal of the greater. There was no showing off now, no scampering out of sight with Pansy to perplex and tire her companion, no saucy remarks on La Belle Dame Sans Merci. Elfride was burdened with the very intensity of her love. Knight did most of the talking along the journey. Elfride silently listened, and entirely resigned herself to the motions of the ambling horse upon which she sat, alternately rising and sinking gently, like a sea bird upon a sea wave. When they had reached the limit of a quadruped's possibilities in walking, Knight tenderly lifted her from the saddle, tied the horse, and rambled on with her to the seat in the rock. Knight sat down and drew Elfride deftly beside him, and they looked over the sea. 2 or 3 degrees above that melancholy and eternally level line, the ocean horizon, hung a sun of brass, with no visible rays, in a sky of ashen hue. It was a sky the sun did not illuminate or enkindle, as is usual at sunsets. This sheet of sky was met by the salt mass of grey water, flecked here and there with white. A waft of dampness occasionally rose to their faces, which was probably rarefied spray from the blows of the sea upon the foot of the cliff. Elfride wished it could be a longer time ago that she had sat there with Stephen as her lover, and agreed to be his wife. The significant closeness of that time to the present was another item to add to the list of passionate fears which were chronic with her now. Yet Knight was very tender this evening, and sustained her close to him as they sat. Not a word had been uttered by either since sitting down, when Knight said musingly, looking still afar, "I wonder if any lovers in past years ever sat here with arms locked as we do now. Probably they have, for the place seems formed for a seat." Her recollection of a well-known pair who had, and the much talked of loss which had ensued therefrom, and how the young man had been sent back to look for the missing article, led Elfride to glance down to her side and behind her back. Many people who lose a trinket involuntarily give a momentary look for it in passing the spot, ever so long afterwards. They do not often find it. Elfride, in turning her head, saw something shine weakly from a crevice in the rocky sedile. Only for a few minutes during the day did the sun light the alcove to its innermost rifts and slits, but these were the minutes now, and its level rays did Elfride the good or evil turn of revealing the lost ornament. Elfride's thoughts instantly reverted to the words she had unintentionally uttered upon what had been going on when the earring was lost, and she was immediately seized with a misgiving that Knight, on seeing the object, would be reminded of her words. Her instinctive act, therefore, was to secure it privately. It was so deep in the crack that Elfride could not pull it out with her hand, though she made several surreptitious trials. "What are you doing, Elfie?" said Knight, noticing her attempts, and looking behind him likewise. She had relinquished the endeavour, but too late. Knight peered into the joint from which her hand had been withdrawn, and saw what she had seen. He instantly took a penknife from his pocket, and by dint of probing and scraping brought the earring out upon open ground. "It is not yours, surely?" he inquired. "Yes, it is," she said quietly. "Well, that is a most extraordinary thing, that we should find it like this." Knight then remembered more circumstances. "What? Is it the one you have told me of?" "Yes." The unfortunate remark of hers at the kiss came to his mind, if eyes were ever an index to be trusted. Trying to repress the words he yet spoke on the subject, more to obtain assurance than what it had seemed to imply was not true than from a wish to pry into bygones. "Were you really engaged to be married to that lover?" he said, looking straight forward at the sea again. "Yes, but not exactly. Yet I think I was." "Oh, Elfride, engaged to be married!" he murmured. "It would have been called a secret engagement, I suppose. But don't look so disappointed. Don't blame me." "No, no." "Why do you say no, no, in such a way? Sweetly enough, but so barely." Knight made no direct reply to this. "Elfride, I told you once," he said, following out his thoughts, "that I never kissed a woman as a sweetheart until I kissed you. A kiss is not much, I suppose, and it happens to few young people to be able to avoid all blandishments and attentions, except from the one they afterwards marry. But I have a peculiar weakness, Elfride, and because I have led a peculiar life I must suffer for it, I suppose. I had hoped, well, what I had no right to hope in connection with you. You naturally granted your former lover the privileges you grant me." A yes came from her like the last sad whisper of a breeze. "And he used to kiss you? Of course he did." "Yes." "And perhaps you allowed him a more free manner in his love making than I have shown in mine?" "No, I did not." This was rather more alertly spoken. "But he adopted it without being allowed?" "Yes." "How much I have made of you, Elfride, and how I have kept aloof!" said Knight in deep and shaken tones. "So many days and hours as I have hoped in you, I have feared to kiss you more than those 2 times. And he made no scruples to." She crept closer to him and trembled as if with cold. Her dread that the whole story, with random additions, would become known to him caused her manner to be so agitated that Knight was alarmed and perplexed into stillness. The actual innocence which made her think so fearfully of what, as the world goes, was not a great matter, magnified her apparent guilt. It may have said to Knight that a woman who was so flurried in the preliminaries must have a dreadful sequel to her tale. "I know," continued Knight, with an indescribable drag of manner and intonation, "I know I am absurdly scrupulous about you, that I want you too exclusively mine. In your past, before you knew me, from your very cradle, I wanted to think you had been mine. I would make you mine by main force, Elfride," he went on vehemently. "I can't help this jealousy over you. It is my nature, and it must be so. And I hate the fact that you have been caressed before. Yes, I hate it." She drew a long deep breath, which was a half sob. Knight's face was hard, and he never looked at her at all, still fixing his gaze far out to sea, which the sun had now resigned to the shade. In high places it is not long from sunset to night, dusk being in a measure banished, and though only evening where they sat, it had been twilight in the valleys for half an hour. Upon the dull expanse of the sea there gradually intensified itself into existence the gleam of a distant lightship.
When that lover first kissed you, Elfride, was it in such a place as this?' 'Yes, it was.' 'You don't tell me anything but what I wring out of you. Why is that? Why have you suppressed all mention of this, when casual confidence of mine should have suggested confidence in return? On board the Juliet, why were you so secret? It seemed like being made a fool of, Elfride, to think that when I was teaching you how desirable it was that we should have no secrets from each other, you were assenting in words, but in act contradicting me. Confidence would have been so much more promising for our happiness. If you had had confidence in me and told me willingly, I should be different. But you suppress everything, and I shall question you. Did you live at Endelstow at that time?' 'Yes,' she said faintly. 'Where were you when he first kissed you?' 'Sitting in this seat.' 'Ah, I thought so,' said Knight, rising and facing her. 'And that accounts for everything. The exclamation which you explained deceitfully, and all. Forgive the harsh word, Elfride. Forgive it.' He smiled a surface smile as he continued. 'What a poor mortal I am to play second fiddle in everything, and to be deluded by fibs.' 'Oh, don't say it. Don't, Harry.' 'Where did he kiss you, besides here?' 'Sitting on a tomb in the churchyard, and other places,' she answered with slow recklessness. 'Never mind, never mind,' he exclaimed, on seeing her tears and perturbation. 'I don't want to grieve you. I don't care.' But Knight did care. 'It makes no difference, you know,' he continued, seeing she did not reply. 'I feel cold,' said Elfride. 'Shall we go home?' 'Yes. It is late in the year to sit long out of doors. We ought to be off this ledge before it gets too dark to let us see our footing. I dare say the horse is impatient.' Knight spoke the merest commonplace to her now. He had hoped to the last moment that she would have volunteered the whole story of her first attachment. It grew more and more distasteful to him that she should have a secret of this nature. Such entire confidence as he had pictured as about to exist between himself and the innocent young wife who had known no lover's tone save his, was this its beginning? He lifted her upon her horse, and they went along constrainedly. The poison of suspicion was doing its work well. An incident occurred on this homeward journey which was long remembered by both, as adding shade to shadow. Knight could not keep from his mind the words of Adam's reproach to Eve in Paradise Lost, and at last whispered them to himself. 'Fooled and beguiled, by him thou, I by thee.' 'What did you say?' Elfride inquired timorously. 'It was only a quotation.' They had now dropped into a hollow, and the church tower made its appearance against the pale evening sky, its lower part being hidden by some intervening trees. Elfride, being denied an answer, was looking at the tower and trying to think of some contrasting quotation she might use to regain his tenderness. After a little thought, she said in winning tones, 'Thou hast been my hope, and a strong tower for me against the enemy.' They passed on. A few minutes later 3 or 4 birds were seen to fly out of the tower. 'The strong tower moves,' said Knight with surprise. A corner of the square mass swayed forward, sank, and vanished. A loud rumble followed, and a cloud of dust arose where all had previously been so clear. 'The church restorers have done it,' said Elfride. At this minute Mr. Swancourt was seen approaching them. He came up with a bustling demeanour, apparently much engrossed by some business in hand. 'We have got the church tower down!' he exclaimed. 'It came rather quicker than we had intended it should. The first idea was to take it down stone by stone, you know. In doing this the crack widened considerably, and it was not believed safe for the men to stand upon the walls any longer. Then we decided to undermine it, and 3 men set to work in the weakest corner this afternoon. They had left off for the evening, intended to give the final blow to-morrow morning, and had been home about half an hour when down it came. A very successful job, a very fine job indeed. But he was a tough old fellow in spite of the crack. Here Mr. Swancourt wiped from his face the perspiration his excitement had caused him. 'Poor old tower,' said Elfride. 'Yes, I am sorry for it,' said Knight. 'It was an interesting piece of antiquity, a local record of local art.' 'Ah, but my dear sir, we shall have a new one,' expostulated Mr. Swancourt. 'A splendid tower, designed by a first-rate London man, in the newest style of Gothic art, and full of Christian feeling.' 'Indeed,' said Knight. 'Oh yes, not in the barbarous clumsy architecture of this neighbourhood. You see nothing so rough and pagan anywhere else in England. When the men are gone, I would advise you to go and see the church before anything further is done to it. You can now sit in the chancel and look down the nave through the west arch, and through that far out to sea. In fact,' said Mr. Swancourt significantly, 'if a wedding were performed at the altar to-morrow morning, it might be witnessed from the deck of a ship on a voyage to the South Seas with a good glass. However, after dinner, when the moon has risen, go up and see it for yourselves.' Knight assented with feverish readiness. He had decided within the last few minutes that he could not rest another night without further talk with Elfride upon the subject which now divided them. He was determined to know all, and relieve his disquiet in some way. Elfride would gladly have escaped further converse alone with him that night, but it seemed inevitable. Just after moonrise they left the house. How little any expectation of the moonlight prospect, which was the ostensible reason for their pilgrimage, had to do with Knight's real motive in getting. A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 32. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 32. Had I wist before I kissed. It was now October, and the night air was chill. After looking to see that she was well wrapped up, Knight took her along the hillside path they had ascended so many times in each other's company, when doubt was a thing unknown. On reaching the church, they found that one side of the tower was, as the vicar had stated, entirely removed, and lying in the shape of rubbish at their feet. The tower on its eastern side still was firm, and might have withstood the shock of storms and the siege of battering years for many a generation, even now. They entered by the side door, went eastward, and sat down by the altar steps. The heavy arch spanning the junction of the tower and nave formed to-night a black frame to a distant misty view, stretching far westward. Just outside the arch came the heap of fallen stones, then a portion of moonlit churchyard, then the wide and convex sea behind. It was a coup d'oeil which had never been possible since the medieval masons first attached the old tower to the older church it dignified, and hence must be supposed to have had an interest apart from that of simple moonlight on ancient wall and sea and shore, any mention of which has by this time, it is to be feared, become one of the cuckoo cries, which are heard but not regarded. Rays of crimson, blue, and purple shone upon the twain from the east window behind them, wherein saints and angels vied with each other in primitive surroundings of landscape and sky, and threw upon the pavement at the sitter's feet a softer reproduction of the same translucent hues, amid which the shadows of the two living heads of Knight and Elfride were opaque and prominent blots. Presently the moon became covered by a cloud, and the iridescence died away. 'There, it is gone,' said Knight. I have been thinking, Elfride, that this place we sit on is where we may hope to kneel together soon. But I am restless and uneasy, and you know why.' Before she replied, the moonlight returned again, irradiating that portion of churchyard within her view. It brightened the near part first, and against the background which the cloud shadow had not yet uncovered, stood, brightest of all, a white tomb, the tomb of young Jethway. Knight, still alive on the subject of Elfride's secret, thought of her words concerning the kiss that had once occurred on a tomb in this churchyard. 'Elfride,' he said, with a superficial archness which did not half cover an undercurrent of reproach, 'do you know, I think you might have told me voluntarily about the past, of kisses and betrothing, without giving me so much uneasiness and trouble. Was that the tomb you alluded to as having sat on with him?' She waited an instant. 'Yes,' she said. The correctness of his random shot startled Knight, though, considering that almost all the other memorials in the churchyard were upright headstones upon which nobody could possibly sit, it was not so wonderful. Elfride did not even now go on with the explanation her exacting lover wished to have, and her reticence began to irritate him as before. He was inclined to read her a lecture. 'Why don't you tell me all?' he said somewhat indignantly. 'Elfride, there is not a single subject upon which I feel more strongly than upon this, that everything ought to be cleared up between two persons before they become husband and wife. See how desirable and wise such a course is, in order to avoid disagreeable contingencies in the form of discoveries afterwards. For, Elfride, a secret of no importance at all may be made the basis of some fatal misunderstanding only because it is discovered and not confessed. They say there never was a couple of whom one had not some secret the other never knew of, or was intended to know. This may or may not be true, but if it be true, some have been happy in spite rather than in consequence of it. If a man were to see another man looking significantly at his wife, and she were blushing crimson and appearing startled, do you think he would be so well satisfied with, for instance, her truthful explanation that once, to her great annoyance, she accidentally fainted into his arms, as if she had said it voluntarily long ago, before the circumstance occurred which forced it from her? Suppose that admirer you spoke of in connection with the tomb yonder should turn up and bother me. It would embitter our lives, if I were then half in the dark as I am now.' Knight spoke the latter sentences with growing force. 'It cannot be,' she said. 'Why not?' he asked sharply. Elfride was distressed to find him in so stern a mood, and she trembled. In a confusion of ideas, probably not intending a wilful prevarication, she answered hurriedly, 'If he is dead, how can you meet him?' 'He is dead? Oh, that is different altogether,' said Knight, immensely relieved. 'But let me see, what did you say about that tomb and him?' 'That's his tomb,' she continued faintly. 'What? Was he who lies buried there the man who was your lover?' Knight asked in a distinct voice. 'Yes, and I didn't love him or encourage him.' 'But you let him kiss you. You said so, you know, Elfride.' She made no reply. 'Why,' said Knight, recollecting circumstances by degrees, 'you surely said you were in some degree engaged to him, and of course you were if he kissed you. And now you say you never encouraged him. And I have been fancying you said, I am almost sure you did, that you were sitting with him on that tomb. Good God!' he cried, suddenly starting up in anger. 'Are you telling me untruths? Why should you play with me like this? I'll have the right of it. Elfride, we shall never be happy. There's a blight upon us, or me, or you, and it must be cleared off before we marry.' Knight moved away impetuously, as if to leave her. She jumped up and clutched his arm. 'Don't go, Harry, don't! 'Tell me then,' said Knight sternly. 'And remember this, no more fibs, or upon my soul I shall hate you. Heavens, that I should come to this, to be made a fool of by a girl's untruths!' 'Don't treat me so cruelly! O Harry, Harry, have pity and withdraw those dreadful words! I am truthful by nature, I am, and I don't know how I came to make you misunderstand, but I was frightened.' She quivered so in her perturbation that she shook him with her. 'Did you say you were sitting on that tomb?' he asked moodily. 'Yes, and it was true.' 'Then how, in the name of heaven, can a man sit upon his own tomb?' 'That was another man. Forgive me, Harry, won't you?' 'What? A lover in the tomb, and a lover on it?' 'Oh, yes.' 'Then there were two before me?' 'I suppose so.' 'Now, don't be a silly woman with your supposing. I hate all that,' said Knight contemptuously almost. 'Well, we learn strange things. I don't know what I might have done. No man can say into what shape circumstances may warp him. But I hardly think I should have had the conscience to accept the favours of a new lover, whilst sitting over the poor remains of the old one. Upon my soul, I don't.' Knight, in moody meditation, continued looking towards the tomb, which stood staring them in the face like an avenging ghost. 'But you wrong me, oh so grievously!' she cried. 'I did not meditate any such thing. Believe me, Harry, I did not. It only happened so, quite of itself.' 'Well, I suppose you didn't intend such a thing,' he said. 'Nobody ever does,' he sadly continued. 'And him in the grave I never once loved.' 'I suppose the second lover and you, as you sat there, vowed to be faithful to each other for ever?' Elfride only replied by quick heavy breaths, showing she was on the brink of a sob. 'You don't choose to be anything but reserved, then?' he said imperatively. 'Of course we did,' she responded. 'Of course! You seem to treat the subject very lightly.' 'It is past, and is nothing to us now.' 'Elfride, it is a nothing which, though it may make a careless man laugh, cannot but make a genuine one grieve. It is a very gnawing pain. Tell me straight through, all of it.' 'Never! O Harry, how can you expect it, when so little of it makes you so harsh with me?' 'Now, Elfride, listen to this. You know that what you have told only jars the subtler fancies in one after all. The feeling I have about it would be called, and is, mere sentimentality, and I don't want you to suppose that an ordinary previous engagement of a straightforward kind would make any practical difference in my love, or my wish to make you my wife. But you seem to have more to tell, and that's where the wrong is. Is there more?' 'Not much more,' she wearily answered. Knight preserved a grave silence for a minute. 'Not much more,' he said at last. 'I should think not, indeed.' His voice assumed a low and steady pitch. 'Elfride, you must not mind my saying a strange sounding thing, for say it I shall. It is this, that if there were much more to add to an account which already includes all the particulars that a broken marriage engagement could possibly include with propriety, it must be some exceptional thing which might make it impossible for me or any one else to love you and to marry you.' Knight's disturbed mood led him much further than he would have gone in a quieter moment, and, even as it was, had she been assertive to any degree, he would not have been so peremptory; and had she been a stronger character, more practical and less imaginative, she would have made more use of her position in his heart to influence him. But the confiding tenderness which had won him is ever accompanied by a sort of self-committal to the stream of events, leading every such woman to trust more to the kindness of fate for good results than to any argument of her own. 'Well, well,' he murmured cynically, 'I won't say it's your fault. It is my ill luck, I suppose. I had no real right to question you. Everybody would say it was presuming. But when we have misunderstood, we feel injured by the subject of our misunderstanding. You never said you had had nobody else here making love to you, so why should I blame you? Elfride, I beg your pardon.'
'No, no, I would rather have your anger than that cool, aggrieved politeness. Do drop that, Harry. Why should you inflict that upon me? It reduces me to the level of a mere acquaintance.'
'You do that with me. Why not confidence for confidence?'
'Yes, but I didn't ask you a single question with regard to your past. I didn't wish to know about it. All I cared for was that wherever you came from, whatever you had done, whoever you had loved, you were mine at last. Harry, if originally you had known I had loved, would you never have cared for me?'
'I won't quite say that, though I own that the idea of your inexperienced state had a great charm for me. But I think this, that if I had known there was any phase of your past love you would refuse to reveal if I asked to know it, I should never have loved you.'
Elfride sobbed bitterly. 'Am I such a mere characterless toy as to have no attraction in me apart from freshness? Haven't I brains? You said I was clever and ingenious in my thoughts, and isn't that anything? Have I not some beauty? I think I have a little, and I know I have. Yes, I do. You have praised my voice, and my manner, and my accomplishments. Yet all these together are so much rubbish because I accidentally saw a man before you.'
'Oh, come, Elfride. Accidentally saw a man is very cool. You loved him, remember.'
'And loved him a little.'
'And refuse now to answer the simple question how it ended. Do you refuse still, Elfride?'
'You have no right to question me so. You said so. It is unfair. Trust me as I trust you.'
'That's not at all.'
'I shall not love you if you are so cruel. It is cruel to me to argue like this.'
'Perhaps it is. Yes, it is. I was carried away by my feeling for you. Heaven knows that I don't mean to, but I have loved you so that I have used you badly.'
'I don't mind it, Harry,' she instantly answered, creeping up and nestling against him. 'And I will not think at all that you used me harshly, if you will forgive me, and not be vexed with me any more. I do wish I had been exactly as you thought I was, but I could not help it, you know. If I had only known you had been coming, what a nunnery I would have lived in to have been good enough for you.'
'Well, never mind,' said Knight, and he turned to go. He endeavoured to speak sportively as they went. 'Diogenes Laertius says that philosophers used voluntarily to deprive themselves of sight to be uninterrupted in their meditations. Men, becoming lovers, ought to do the same thing.'
'Why? But never mind, I don't want to know. Don't speak laconically to me,' she said with deprecation.
'Why? Because they would never then be distracted by discovering their idol was second hand.'
She looked down and sighed, and they passed out of the crumbling old place and slowly crossed to the churchyard entrance. Knight was not himself, and he could not pretend to be. She had not told all. He supported her lightly over the stile, and was practically as attentive as a lover could be. But there had passed away a glory, and the dream was not as it had been of yore. Perhaps Knight was not shaped by nature for a marrying man. Perhaps his lifelong constraint towards women, which he had attributed to accident, was not chance after all, but the natural result of instinctive acts so minute as to be undiscernible even by himself. Or whether the rough dispelling of any bright illusion, however imaginative, depreciates the real and unexaggerated brightness which appertains to its basis, one cannot say. Certain it was that Knight's disappointment at finding himself second or third in the field, at Elfride's momentary
A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 33. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 33. O daughter of Babylon, wasted with misery. A habit of nights, when not immediately occupied with Elfride, to walk by himself for half an hour or so between dinner and bedtime, had become familiar to his friends at Endelstow, Elfride herself among them. When he had helped her over the stile, she said gently, "If you wish to take your usual turn on the hill, Harry, I can run down to the house alone." "Thank you, Elfride. Then I think I will." Her form diminished to blackness in the moonlight, and Knight, after remaining upon the churchyard stile a few minutes longer, turned back again towards the building. His usual course now was to light a cigar or pipe and indulge in a quiet meditation, but to-night his mind was too tense to bethink itself of such a solace. He merely walked around to the site of the fallen tower, and sat himself down upon some of the large stones which had composed it until this day, when the chain of circumstances originated by Stephen Smith, while in the employ of Mr. Hewby, the London man of art, had brought about its overthrow. Pondering on the possible episodes of Elfride's past, and on how he had supposed her to have had no past justifying the name, he sat and regarded the white tomb of young Jethway, now close in front of him. The sea, though comparatively placid, could as usual be heard from this point along the whole distance between promontories to the right and left, floundering and entangling itself along the insulated stacks of rock which dotted the water's edge, the miserable skeletons of tortured old cliffs that would not even yet succumb to the wear and tear of the tides. As a change from thoughts not of a very cheerful kind, Knight attempted exertion. He stood up and prepared to ascend to the summit of the ruinous heap of stones, from which a more extended outlook was obtainable than from the ground. He stretched out his arm to seize the projecting arras of a larger block than ordinary, and so to help himself up, when his hand lighted plump upon a substance differing in the greatest possible degree from what he had expected to seize hard stone. It was stringy and entangled, and trailed upon the stone. The deep shadow from the aisle wall prevented his seeing anything here distinctly, and he began guessing as a necessity. "It is a tressy species of moss or lichen," he said to himself, but it lay loosely over the stone. "It is a tuft of grass," he said, but it lacked the roughness and humidity of the finest grass. "It is a mason's whitewash brush." Such brushes, he remembered, were more bristly, and, however much used in repairing a structure, would not be required in pulling one down. He said, "It must be a thready silk fringe." He felt further in. It was somewhat warm. Knight instantly felt somewhat cold. To find the coldness of inanimate matter where you expect warmth is startling enough, but a colder temperature than that of the body being rather the rule than the exception in common substances, it hardly conveys such a shock to the system as finding warmth where utter frigidity is anticipated. "God only knows what it is," he said. He felt further, and in the course of a minute put his hand upon a human head. The head was warm but motionless. The thready mass was the hair of the head, long and straggling, showing that the head was a woman's. Knight, in his perplexity, stood still for a moment and collected his thoughts. The vicar's account of the fall of the tower was that the workmen had been undermining it all day, and had left in the evening, intending to give the finishing stroke the next morning. Half an hour after they had gone, the undermined angle came down. The woman, who was half buried, as it seemed, must have been beneath it at the moment of the fall. Knight leapt up and began endeavouring to remove the rubbish with his hands. The heap overlying the body was for the most part fine and dusty, but in immense quantity. It would be a saving of time to run for assistance. He crossed to the churchyard wall, and hastened down the hill. A little way down, an intersecting road passed over a small ridge, which now showed up darkly against the moon, and this road here formed a kind of notch in the skyline. At the moment that Knight arrived at the crossing, he beheld a man on this eminence, coming towards him. Knight turned aside and met the stranger. "There has been an accident at the church," said Knight without preface. "The tower has fallen on somebody who has been lying there ever since. Will you come and help?" "That I will," said the man. "It is a woman," said Knight, as they hurried back, "and I think we two are enough to extricate her. Do you know of a shovel?" "The grave digging shovels are about somewhere. They used to stay in the tower." "And there must be some belonging to the workmen." They searched about, and in an angle of the porch found 3 carefully stowed away. Going around to the west end, Knight signified the spot of the tragedy. "We ought to have brought a lantern," he exclaimed, "but we may be able to do without." He set to work removing the superincumbent mass. The other man, who looked on somewhat helplessly at first, now followed the example of Knight's activity, and removed the larger stones which were mingled with the rubbish. But with all their effort it was quite 10 minutes before the body of the unfortunate creature could be extricated. They lifted her as carefully as they could, breathlessly carried her to Felix Jethway's tomb, which was only a few steps westward, and laid her thereon. "Is she dead indeed?" said the stranger. "She appears to be," said Knight. "Which is the nearest house? The vicarage, I suppose?" "Yes, but since we shall have to call a surgeon from Castle Boterel, I think it would be better to carry her in that direction instead of away from the town." "And is it not much further to the first house we come to going that way than to the vicarage or to the crags?" "Not much," the stranger replied. "Suppose we take her there, then. And I think the best way to do it would be thus, if you don't mind joining hands with me." "Not in the least. I am glad to assist." Making a kind of cradle by clasping their hands crosswise under the inanimate woman, they lifted her, and walked on side by side down a path indicated by the stranger, who appeared to know the locality well. "I have been sitting in the church for nearly an hour," Knight resumed, when they were out of the churchyard. "Afterwards I walked round to the site of the fallen tower, and so found her. It is painful to think I unconsciously wasted so much time in the very presence of a perishing, flying soul." "The tower fell at dusk, did it not? Quite 2 hours ago, I think." "Yes, she must have been there alone. What could have been her object in visiting the churchyard then? It is difficult to say." The stranger looked inquiringly into the reclining face of the motionless form they bore. "Would you turn her head round a moment, so that the light shines on her face?" he said. They turned her face to the moon, and the man looked closer into her features. "Why, I know her!" he exclaimed. "Who is she?" "Mrs. Jethway, and the cottage we are taking her to is her own. She is a widow, and I was speaking to her only this afternoon. I was at Castle Boterel post office, and she came there to post a letter. Poor soul! Let us hurry on. Hold my wrist a little tighter. Was not that tomb we laid her on the tomb of her only son?" "Yes, it was. Yes, I see it now. She was there to visit the tomb. Since the death of that son she has been a desolate, desponding woman, always bewailing him. She was a farmer's wife, very well educated, a governess originally, I believe." Knight's heart was moved to sympathy. His own fortune seemed in some strange way to be interwoven with those of this Jethway family, through the influence of Elfride over himself and the unfortunate son of that house. He made no reply, and they still walked on. "She begins to feel heavy," said the stranger, breaking the silence. "Yes, she does," said Knight, and after another pause added, "I think I have met you before, though where I cannot recollect. May I ask who you are?" "Oh yes, I am Lord Luxellian. Who are you?" "I am a visitor at the Crags, Mr. Knight." 'I have heard of you, Mr. Knight.'
'And I of you, Lord Luxellian. I am glad to meet you.'
'I may say the same. I am familiar with your name in print.' 'And I with yours. Is this the house?' 'Yes.' The door was locked. Knight, reflecting a moment, searched the pocket of the lifeless woman, and found therein a large key, which, on being applied to the door, opened it easily. The fire was out, but the moonlight entered the quarried window and made patterns upon the floor. The rays enabled him to see that the room into which they had entered was pretty well furnished, it being the same room that Elfride had visited alone 2 or 3 evenings earlier. They deposited their still burden on an old fashioned couch which stood against the wall, and Knight searched about for a lamp or candle. He found a candle on a shelf, lighted it, and placed it on the table. Both Knight and Lord Luxellian examined the pale countenance attentively, and both were nearly convinced that there was no hope. No marks of violence were visible in the casual examination they made. 'I think that as I know where Dr. Granson lives,' said Lord Luxellian, 'I had better run for him whilst you stay here.' Knight agreed to this. Lord Luxellian went off, and his hurrying footsteps died away. Knight continued bending over the body, and a few minutes longer of careful scrutiny perfectly satisfied him that the woman was far beyond the reach of the lancet and the drug. Her extremities were already beginning to get stiff and cold. Knight covered her face and sat down. The minutes went by. The essayist remained musing on all the occurrences of the night. His eyes were directed upon the table, and he had seen for some time that writing materials were spread upon it. He now noticed these more particularly. There were an inkstand, pen, blotting book, and note paper. Several sheets of paper were thrust aside from the rest, upon which letters had been begun and relinquished, as if their form had not been satisfactory to the writer. A stick of black sealing wax and seal were there too, as if the ordinary fastening had not been considered sufficiently secure. The abandoned sheets of paper lying as they did open upon the table made it possible as he sat to read the few words written on each. One ran thus: Sir, as a woman who was once blessed with a dear son of her own, I implore you to accept a warning. Another: Sir, if you will deign to receive warning from a stranger before it is too late to alter your course, listen to. The third: Sir, with this letter I enclose to you another which, unaided by any explanation from me, tells a startling tale. I wish, however, to add a few words to make your delusion yet more clear to you. It was plain that after these renounced beginnings a fourth letter had been written and dispatched, which had been deemed the proper one. Upon the table were 2 drops of sealing wax, the stick from which they were taken having been laid down, overhanging the edge of the table, the end of it drooped, showing that the wax was placed there whilst warm. There was the chair in which the writer had sat, the impression of the letter's address upon the blotting paper, and the poor widow who had caused these results lying dead hard by. Knight had seen enough to lead him to the conclusion that Mrs. Jethway, having matter of great importance to communicate to some friend or acquaintance, had written him a very careful letter, and gone herself to post it, that she had not returned to the house from that time of leaving it till Lord Luxellian and himself had brought her back dead. The unutterable melancholy of the whole scene, as he waited on, silent and alone, did not altogether clash with the mood of Knight. Even though he was the affianced of a fair and winning girl, and though so lately he had been in her company. Whilst sitting on the remains of the demolished tower, he had defined a new sensation, that the lengthened course of inaction he had been lately indulging in on Elfride's account might probably not be good for him as a man who had work to do. It could quickly be put to an end by hastening on his marriage with her. Knight, in his own opinion, was one who had missed his mark by excessive aiming. Having now, to a great extent, given up ideal ambitions, he wished earnestly
to direct his powers to a more practical channel, and thus correct the introspective tendencies which had never brought himself much happiness, or done his fellow creatures any great good. To make a start in this new direction by marriage, which, since knowing Elfride, had been so entrancing an idea, was less exquisite to Knight. That the curtailment of his illusion regarding her had something to do with the reaction, and with the return of his old sentiments on wasting time, is more than probable. Though Knight's heart had so greatly mastered him, the mastery was not so complete as to be easily maintained in the face of a moderate intellectual revival. His reverie was broken by the sound of wheels and a horse's tramp. The door opened to admit the surgeon, Lord Luxellian, and a Mr. Coole, coroner for the division, who had been attending at Castle Boterel that very day, and was having an after-dinner chat with the doctor when Lord Luxellian arrived. Next came two female nurses and some idlers. Mr. Granson, after a cursory examination, pronounced the woman dead from suffocation, induced by intense pressure on the respiratory organs, and arrangements were made that the inquiry should take place on the following morning before the return of the coroner to St. Launce's. Shortly afterwards the house of the widow was deserted by all its living occupants, and she abode in death. A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 34. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 34. Yea, happy shall be he that rewardeth thee, as thou hast served us. 16 hours had passed. Knight was entering the ladies' boudoir at the Crags, upon his return from attending the inquest touching the death of Mrs. Jethway. Elfride was not in the apartment. Mrs. Swancourt made a few inquiries concerning the verdict and collateral circumstances. Then she said, 'The postman came this morning, the minute after you left the house. There was only one letter for you, and I have it here.' She took a letter from the lid of her work-box and handed it to him. Knight took the missive abstractedly, but, struck by its appearance, murmured a few words and left the room. The letter was fastened with a black seal, and the handwriting in which it was addressed had lain under his eyes long and prominently, only the evening before. Knight was greatly agitated, and looked about for a spot where he might be secure from interruption. It was a season of heavy dews, which lay on the herbage in shady places all the day long. Nevertheless, he entered a small patch of neglected grass plat enclosed by the shrubbery, and there perused the letter, which he had opened on his way thither. The handwriting, the seal, the paper, the introductory words, all had told on the instant that the letter had come to him from the hands of the widow Jethway, now dead and cold. He had instantly understood that the unfinished notes which caught his eye yesternight were intended for nobody but himself. He had remembered some of the words of Elfride in her sleep on the steamer, that somebody was not to tell him of something, or it would be her ruin, a circumstance hitherto deemed so trivial and meaningless that he had well nigh forgotten it. All these things infused into him an emotion intense in power and supremely distressing in quality. The paper in his hand quivered as he read. The Valley, Endelstow. Sir, a woman who has not much in the world to lose by any censure this act may bring upon her wishes to give you some hints concerning a lady you love. If you will deign to accept a warning before it is too late, you will notice what your correspondent has to say. You are deceived. Can such a woman as this be worthy? One who encouraged an honest youth to love her, then slighted him so that he died. One who next took a man of no birth as a lover, who was forbidden the house by her father. One who secretly left home to be married to that man, met him, and went with him to London. One who, for some reason or other, returned again unmarried. One who, in her after correspondence with him, went so far as to address him as her husband. One who wrote the enclosed letter to ask me, who better than anybody else knows the story, to keep the scandal secret. I hope soon to be beyond the reach of either blame or praise, but before removing me, God has put it in my power to avenge the death of my son. Gertrude Jethway. The letter enclosed was the note in pencil that Elfride had written in Mrs. Jethway's cottage. Dear Mrs. Jethway, I have been to visit you. I wanted much to see you, but I cannot wait any longer. I came to beg you not to execute the threat you have repeated to me. Do not, I beseech you, Mrs. Jethway, let any one know I ran away from home. It would ruin me with him, and break my heart. I will do anything for you if you will be kind to me. In the name of our common womanhood, do not, I implore you, make a scandal of me. Yours, E. Swancourt. Knight turned his head wearily towards the house. The ground rose rapidly on nearing the shrubbery in which he stood, raising it almost to a level with the first floor of the crags. Elfride's dressing-room lay in the salient angle in this direction, and it was lighted by two windows in such a position that, from Knight's standing place, his sight passed through both windows, and raked the room. Elfride was there. She was pausing between the two windows, looking at her figure in the cheval glass. She regarded herself long and attentively in front, turned, flung back her head, and observed the reflection over her shoulder. Nobody can predicate as to her object or fancy. She may have done the deed in the very abstraction of deep sadness. She may have been moaning from the bottom of her heart, "How unhappy am I!" But the impression produced on Knight was not a good one. He dropped his eyes moodily. The dead woman's letter had a virtue in the accident of its juncture far beyond any it intrinsically exhibited. Circumstance lent to evil words a ring of pitiless justice echoing from the grave. Knight could not endure their possession. He tore the letter into fragments. He heard a brushing among the bushes behind, and turning his head he saw Elfride following him. The fair girl looked in his face with a wistful smile of hope, too forcedly hopeful to displace the firmly established dread beneath it. His severe words of the previous night still sat heavy upon her. "I saw you from my window, Harry," she said timidly. "The dew will make your feet wet," he observed as one deaf. "I don't mind it." "There is danger in getting feet wet." "Yes. Harry, what is the matter?" "Oh, nothing. Shall I resume the serious conversation I had with you last night?" "No, perhaps not. Perhaps I had better not." "Oh, I cannot tell. How wretched it all is. Ah, I wish you were your own dear self again, and had kissed me when I came up. Why didn't you ask me for one? Why don't you now?" "Too free in manner by half," he heard murmur the voice within him. "It was that hateful conversation last night," she went on. "Oh, those words! Last night was a black night for me." "Kiss! I hate that word. Don't talk of kissing, for God's sake. I should think you might with advantage have shown tact enough to keep back that word kiss, considering those you have accepted." She became very pale, and a rigid and desolate character took possession of her face. The face was so delicate and tender in appearance now, that one could fancy the pressure of a finger upon it would cause a livid spot. Knight walked on, and Elfride with him, silent and unopposing. He opened a gate, and they entered a path across a stubble field. "Perhaps I intrude upon you," she said as he closed the gate. "Shall I go away?" "No. Listen to me, Elfride." Knight's voice was low and unequal. "I have been honest with you. Will you be so with me? If any strange connection has existed between yourself and a predecessor of mine, tell it now. It is better that I know it now, even though the knowledge should part us, than that I should discover it in time to come. And suspicions have been awakened in me.
I think I will not say how, because I despise the means. A discovery of any mystery of your past would embitter our lives.' Knight waited with a slow manner of calmness. His eyes were sad and imperative. They went farther along the path. 'Will you forgive me if I tell you all?' she exclaimed entreatingly. 'I can't promise. So much depends upon what you have to tell.' Elfride could not endure the silence which followed. 'Are you not going to love me?' she burst out. 'Harry, Harry, love me, and speak as usual. Do, I beseech you, Harry.' 'Are you going to act fairly by me?' said Knight with rising anger. 'Or are you not? What have I done to you that I should be put off like this? Be caught like a bird in a springe, everything intended to be hidden from me? Why is it, Elfride? That's what I ask you.' In their agitation they had left the path, and were wandering among the wet and obstructive stubble without knowing or heeding it. 'Oh, what have I done?' she faltered. 'What? How can you ask what, when you know so well? You know that I have designedly been kept in ignorance of something attaching to you, which, had I known of it, might have altered my conduct. And yet you say, what?' She drooped visibly, and made no answer. 'Not that I believe in malicious letter writers and whisperers. Not I. I don't know whether I do or don't. Upon my soul I can't tell. I know this: a religion was building itself upon you in my heart. I looked into your eyes, and thought I saw there truth and innocence as pure and perfect as ever embodied by God in the flesh of woman. Perfect truth is too much to expect, but ordinary truth I will have, or nothing at all. Just say, then, is the matter you keep back of the gravest importance, or is it not?'
'I don't understand all your meaning. If I have hidden anything from you, it is because I loved you so, and I feared to lose you.'
'Since you are not given to confidence, I want to ask you some plain questions. Have I your permission?'
'Yes,' she said, and there came over her face a weary resignation. 'Say the harshest words you can. I will bear them.'
'There is a scandal in the air concerning you, Elfride, and I cannot even combat it without knowing definitely what it is. It may not refer to you entirely, or even at all.' Knight trifled in the very bitterness of his feeling. In the time of the French Revolution, Parisot, a ballet master, was beheaded, by mistake for Parisot, a captain of the King's Guard. I wish there was another E. Swancourt in the neighbourhood. Look at this.' He handed her the letter she had written and left on the table at Mrs. Jethway's. She looked over it vacantly.
'It is not so much as it seems,' she pleaded. 'It seems wickedly deceptive to look at now, but it had a much more natural origin than you think. My sole wish was not to endanger our love. Oh, Harry, that was all my idea. It was not much harm.' 'Yes, yes, but independently of the poor miserable creature's remarks, it seems to imply something wrong.' 'What remarks?' 'Those she wrote me, now torn to pieces. Elfride, did you run away with the man you loved? That was the damnable statement. Has such an accusation life in it, really, truly, Elfride?' 'Yes,' she whispered. Knight's countenance sank. 'To be married to him?' came huskily from his lips. 'Yes. Oh, forgive me. I had never seen you, Harry.' 'To London?' 'Yes, but I—' 'Answer my questions. Say nothing else. Elfride, did you ever deliberately try to marry him in secret?' 'No, not deliberately.' 'But you did do it?' A feeble red passed over her face. 'Yes,' she said. 'And after that, did you write to him as your husband, and he address you as his wife?' 'Listen, it was—' 'Do answer me. Only answer me.' 'Then, yes, we did.' Her lips shook, but it was with some little dignity that she continued. 'I would gladly have told you, for I knew and know I had done wrong, but I dared not.
I loved you too well. Oh, so well. You have been everything in the world to me, and you are now. Will you not forgive me?' It is a melancholy thought that men who first will not allow the verdict of perfection they pronounce upon their sweethearts or wives to be disturbed by God's own testimony to the contrary, will, once suspecting their purity, morally hang them upon evidence they would be ashamed to admit in judging a dog. The reluctance to tell which arose from Elfride's simplicity in thinking herself so much more culpable than she really was, had been doing fatal work in Knight's mind. The man of many ideas, now that his first dream of impossible things was over, vibrated too far in the contrary direction, and her every movement of feature, every tremor, every confused word, was taken as so much proof of her unworthiness. 'Elfride, we must bid good-bye to compliment,' said Knight. 'We must do without politeness now. Look into my face, and as you believe in God above, tell me truly one thing more. Were you away alone with him?' 'Yes.' 'Did you return home the same day on which you left it?' 'No.' The word fell like a bolt, and the very land and sky seemed to suffer. Knight turned aside. Meantime Elfride's countenance wore a look indicating utter despair of being able to explain matters so that they would seem no more than they really were. A despair which not only relinquishes the hope of direct explanation, but wearily gives up all collateral chances of extenuation. The scene was engraved for years on the retina of Knight's eye: the dead brown stubble, the weeds among it, the distant belt of beeches shutting out the view of the house, the leaves of which were now red and sick to death. 'You must forget me,' he said. 'We shall not marry, Elfride.' How much anguish passed into her soul at those words from him was told by the look of supreme torture she wore. 'What meaning have you, Harry? You only say so, do you?' She looked doubtingly up at him, and tried to laugh, as if the unreality of his words must be unquestionable. 'You are not in earnest. I know, I hope you are not. Surely I belong to you, and you are going to keep me for yours.' 'Elfride, I have been speaking too roughly to you. I have said what I ought only have thought. I like you, and let me give you a word of advice. Marry your man as soon as you can. However weary of each other you may feel, you belong to each other, and I am not going to step between you. Do you think I would? Do you think I could for a moment? If you cannot marry him now, and another makes you his wife, do not reveal this secret to him after marriage if you do not before. Honesty would be damnation then.' Bewildered by his expressions, she exclaimed, 'No, no, I will not be a wife unless I am yours, and I must be yours.' 'If we had married—' 'But you don't mean that you will go away and leave me, and not be anything more to me? Oh, you don't!' Convulsive sobs took all the nerve out of her utterance. She checked them, and continued to look in his face for the ray of hope that was not to be found there. 'I am going indoors,' said Knight. 'You will not follow me, Elfride. I wish you not to.' 'Oh no, indeed, I will not.' 'And then I am going to Castle Boterel. Good-bye.' He spoke the farewell as if it were but for the day, lightly, as he had spoken such temporary farewells many times before, and she seemed to understand it as such. Knight had not the power to tell her plainly that he was going for ever. He hardly knew for certain that he was, whether he should rush back again upon the current of an irresistible emotion, or whether he could sufficiently conquer himself, and her in him, to establish that parting as a supreme farewell, and present himself to the world again as no woman's. 10 minutes later he had left the house, leaving directions that if he did not return in the evening his luggage was to be sent to his chambers in London, whence he intended to write to Mr. Swancourt as to the reasons of his sudden departure. He descended the valley, and could not forbear turning his head. He saw the stubble field, and a slight girlish figure in the midst of it, up against the sky. Elfride, docile as ever, had hardly moved a step, for he had said, 'Remain.' He looked and saw her again. He saw her for weeks and months. He withdrew his eyes from the scene. A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 35. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes, by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 35. And wilt thou leave me thus? Say nay. Say nay. The scene shifts to Knight's chambers in Bede's Inn. It was late in the evening of the day following his departure from Endelstow. A drizzling rain descended upon London, forming a humid and dreary halo over every well-lighted street. The rain had not yet been prevalent long enough to give to rapid vehicles that clear and distinct rattle which follows the thorough washing of the stones by a drenching rain, but it was sufficient to make footway and roadway slippery, adhesive, and clogging to both feet and wheels. Knight was standing by the fire, looking into its expiring embers previously to emerging from his door for a dreary journey home to Richmond. His hat was on, and the gas turned off. The blind of the window overlooking the alley was not drawn down, and with the light from beneath, which shone over the ceiling of the room, came, in place of the usual babble, only the reduced clatter and quick speech which were the result of necessity rather than choice. Whilst he stood thus, waiting for the expiration of the few minutes that were wanting to the time for his catching the train, a light tapping upon the door mingled with the other sounds that reached his ears. It was so faint at first that the outer noises were almost sufficient to drown it. Finding it repeated, Knight crossed the lobby, crowded with books and rubbish, and opened the door. A woman, closely muffled up, but visibly of fragile build, was standing on the landing under the gas-light. She sprang forward, flung her arms round Knight's neck, and uttered a low cry. "Oh, Harry, Harry, you are killing me! I could not help coming. Don't send me away, don't. Forgive your Elfride for coming. I love you so." Knight's agitation and astonishment mastered him for a few moments. "Elfride!" he cried. "What does this mean? What have you done?" "Do not hurt me and punish me. Oh, do not! I could not help coming. It was killing me. Last night when you did not come back I could not bear it. I could not. Only let me be with you and see your face, Harry. I don't ask for more." Her eyelids were hot, heavy, and thick with excessive weeping, and the delicate red rose of her cheeks was disfigured and inflamed by the constant chafing of the handkerchief in wiping her many tears. "Who is with you? Have you come alone?" he hurriedly inquired. "Yes. When you did not come home last night, I sat up hoping you would come, and the night was all agony, and I waited on, and you did not come. Then, when it was morning, and your letter said you were gone, I could not endure it, and I ran away from them to St. Launce's, and came by train. And I have been all day travelling to you, and you won't make me go away again, will you, Harry? Because I shall always love you till I die." "Yet it is wrong for you to stay. Oh, Elfride, what have you committed yourself to? It is ruin to your good name to run to me like this. Has not your first experience been sufficient to keep you from these things?" "My name? Harry, I shall die soon, and what good will my name be to me then? Oh, could I but be the man and you the woman, I would not leave you for such a little fault as mine. Do not think it was so vile a thing in me to run away with him. Ah, how I wish you could have run away with 20 women before you knew me, that I might show you I would think it no fault, but be glad to get you after them all, so that I had you. If you only knew me through and through, how true I am, Harry. Cannot I be yours? Say you love me just the same, and don't let me be separated from you again, will you? I cannot bear it, all the long hours and days and nights going on, and you not there, but away because you hate me." "Not hate you, Elfride," he said gently, and supported her with his arm. But you cannot stay here now, just at present, I mean.' 'I suppose I must not. I wish I might. I am afraid that, if you lose sight of me, something dark will happen, and we shall not meet again. Harry, if I am not good enough to be your wife, I wish I could be your servant and live with you, and not be sent away never to see you again. I don't mind what it is except that.' 'No, I cannot send you away. I cannot. God knows what dark future may arise out of this evening's work, but I cannot send you away. You must sit down, and I will endeavour to collect my thoughts, and see what had better be done.' At that moment a loud knocking at the house door was heard by both, accompanied by a hurried ringing of the bell that echoed from attic to basement. The door was quickly opened, and after a few hasty words of converse in the hall, heavy footsteps ascended the stairs. The face of Mr. Swancourt, flushed, grieved, and stern, appeared around the landing of the staircase. He came higher up, and stood beside them. Glancing over and past Knight with silent indignation, he turned to the trembling girl. 'Oh, Elfride, I have found you at last. Are these your tricks, madam? When will you get rid of your idiocies and conduct yourself like a decent woman? Is my family name and house to be disgraced by acts that would be a scandal to a washerwoman's daughter? Come along, madam, come.' 'She is so weary,' said Knight in a voice of intensest anguish. 'Mr. Swancourt, don't be harsh with her. Let me beg you to be tender with her and love her.' 'To you, sir,' said Mr. Swancourt, turning to him as if by the sheer pressure of circumstances, 'I have little to say. I can only remark that the sooner I can retire from your presence, the better I shall be pleased. Why you could not conduct your courtship of my daughter like an honest man, I do not know. Why she, a foolish, inexperienced girl, should have been tempted to this piece of folly, I do not know. Even if she had not known better than to leave her home, you might have, I should think.'
'It is not his fault. He did not tempt me, papa. I came.'
'If you wished the marriage to be broken off, why didn't you say so plainly? If you never intended to marry, why could you not leave her alone? Upon my soul, it grates me to the heart to be obliged to think so ill of a man I thought my friend.' Knight, soul sick and weary of his life, did not arouse himself to utter a word in reply. How should he defend himself when his defence was the accusation of Elfride? On that account he felt a miserable satisfaction in letting her father go on thinking and speaking wrongfully. It was a faint ray of pleasure, straying into the great gloominess of his brain, to think that the vicar might never know but that he, as her lover, tempted her away, which seemed to be the form Mr. Swancourt's misapprehension had taken. 'Now, are you coming?' said Mr. Swancourt to her again. He took her unresisting hand, drew it within his arm, and led her down the stairs. Knight's eyes followed her, the last moment begetting in him a frantic hope that she would turn her head. She passed on, and never looked back. He heard the door open, close again. The wheels of a cab grazed the curbstone, a murmured direction followed. The door was slammed together, and the wheels moved, and they rolled away. From that hour of her reappearance a dreadful conflict raged within the breast of Henry Knight. His instinct, emotion, effectiveness, or whatever it may be called, urged him to stand forward, seize upon Elfride, and be her cherisher and protector through life. Then came the devastating thought that Elfride's childlike unreasoning and indiscreet act in flying to him only proved that the proprieties must be a dead letter with her, that the unreserve, which was really artlessness without ballast, meant indifference to decorum. And what so likely as that such a woman had been deceived in the past? He said to himself in a mood of bitterest cynicism. The suspicious, discreet woman who imagines dark and evil things of all her fellow creatures is far too shrewd to be deluded by man. Trusting beings like Elfride are the women who fall. Hours and days went by, and Knight remained inactive. Lengthening time, which made fainter the heart-awakening power of her presence, strengthened the mental ability to reason her down. Elfride loved him, he knew, and he could not leave off loving her, but marry her he would not. If she could but be again his own Elfride, the woman she had seemed to be. But that woman was dead and buried, and he knew her no more. And how could he marry this Elfride, one who, if he had originally seen her as she was, would have been barely an interesting pitiable acquaintance in his eyes, no more? It cankered his heart to think he was confronted by the closest instance of a worse state of things than any he had assumed in the pleasant social philosophy and satire of his essays. The moral rightness of this man's life was worthy of all praise, but in spite of some intellectual acumen, Knight had in him a modicum of that wrong-headedness which is mostly found in scrupulously honest people. With him, truth seemed too clean and pure an abstraction to be so hopelessly churned in with error as practical persons find it. Having now seen himself mistaken in supposing Elfride to be peerless, nothing on earth could make him believe she was not so very bad after all. He lingered in town a fortnight, doing little else than vibrate between passions and opinions. One idea remained intact, that it was better himself and Elfride should not meet. When he surveyed the volumes on his shelves, few of which had been opened since Elfride first took possession of his heart, their untouched and orderly arrangement reproached him as an apostate from the old faith of his youth and early manhood. He had deserted those never-failing friends, so they seemed to say, for an unstable delight in a ductile woman, which had ended all in bitterness. The spirit of self-denial, verging on asceticism, which had ever animated Knight in old times, announced itself as having departed with the birth of love, with it having gone the self-respect which had compensated for the lack of self-gratification. Poor Elfride, instead of holding as formerly a place in his religion, began to assume the hue of a temptation. Perhaps it was human and correctly natural that Knight never once thought whether he did not owe her a little sacrifice for her unchary devotion in saving his life. With the consciousness of having thus, like Anthony, kissed away kingdoms and provinces, he next considered how he had revealed his higher secrets and intentions to her, an unreserve he would never have allowed himself with any man living. How was it that he had not been able to refrain from telling her of adumbrations heretofore locked in the closest strongholds of his mind? Knight's was a robust intellect, which could escape outside the atmosphere of heart, and perceive that his own love, as well as other people's, could be reduced by change of scene and circumstances. At the same time, the perception was a superimposed sorrow. O last regret, regret can die. But being convinced that the death of his regret was the best thing for him, he did not long shrink from attempting it. He closed his chambers, suspended his connection with editors, and left London for the Continent. Here we will leave him to wander. A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 36. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes, by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 36. The penny's the jewel that beautifies her. I can't think what's coming to these St. Launce's people at all. With their howdy-do's, you mean? Ay, with their howdy-do's and shaking hands, asking me in, and tender inquiries for you, John. These words formed part of a conversation between John Smith and his wife on a Saturday evening in the spring which followed Knight's departure from England. Stephen had long since returned to India, and the persevering couple themselves had migrated from Lord Luxellian's park at Endelstow to a comfortable roadside dwelling about a mile out of St. Launce's, where John had opened a small stone and slate yard in his own name. We came here 6 months ago, continued Mrs. Smith. Though I had paid ready money so many years in the town, my friskier shopkeepers would only speak over the counter. Meet 'em in the street half an hour after, and they treat me with staring ignorance of my face. Look through ye as through a glass winder. Yes, the brazen ones would.
The quiet and cool ones would glance over the top of my head, past my side, over my shoulder, but never meet my eye. The gentle modest would turn their faces south if I were coming east, flit down a passage if I were about to halve the pavement with them. There was the spruce young bookseller would play the same tricks, the butcher's daughters, the upholsterer's young men, hand in glove when doing business out of sight with you, but caring nothing for an old woman when playing the genteel away from all signs of their trade. True enough, Maria. Well, to-day 'tis all different. I'd no sooner got to market than Mrs. Jokes rushed up to me in the eyes of the town and said, "My dear Mrs. Smith, now you must be tired with your walk. Come in and have some lunch, I insist upon it, knowing you so many years as I have. Don't you remember when we used to go looking for owl's feathers together in the castle ruins?" Well, there's no knowing what you might need, so I answered the woman civilly. I hadn't got to the corner before that thriving young lawyer, Sweet, who's quite the dandy, ran after me out of breath. "Mrs. Smith," he says, "excuse my rudeness, but there's a bramble on the tail of your dress which you've dragged in from the country. Allow me to pull it off for you." If you'll believe me, this was in the very front of the town hall. What's the meaning of such sudden love for an old woman? Can't say, unless 'tis repentance. Repentance? Was there ever such a fool as you, John? Did anybody ever repent with money in his pocket and 50 years to live? Now, I've been thinking too, said John, passing over the query as hardly pertinent, that I've had more loving kindness from folks to-day than I've ever had before since we moved here. Why, old Alderman Tope walked out to the middle of the street where I was to shake hands with me, so I did. Having on my working clothes, I thought 'twas odd. Ay, and then there was young Warrington. Who's he? Why, the man in Hill Street who plays and sells flutes, trumpets, and fiddles, and grand pianos. He was talking to Egliskerry, that very small bachelor man with money in the funds. I was going by, I'm sure, without thinking or expecting a nod from men of that glib kidney when in my working clothes. You always will go poking into town in your working clothes. Beg you to change how I will, 'tis no use. Well, however, I was in my working clothes. Warrington saw me. "Ah, Mr. Smith, a fine morning. Excellent weather for building," says he, out as loud and friendly as if I'd met him in some deep hollow, where he could get nobody else to speak to at all. 'Twas odd, for Warrington is one of the very ringleaders of that vast class. At that moment a tap came to the door. The door was immediately opened by Mrs. Smith in person. "You'll excuse us, I'm sure, Mrs. Smith, but this beautiful spring weather was too much for us. Yes, we could stay in no longer, and I took Mrs. Trewin upon my arm directly we'd had a cup of tea, and out we came. And seeing your beautiful crocuses in such bloom, we've taken the liberty to enter. We'll step round the garden, if you don't mind." "Not at all," said Mrs. Smith, and they walked round the garden. She lifted her hands in amazement directly their backs were turned. "Goodness send us grace!" "Who be they?" said her husband. "Actually, Mr. Trewin, the bank manager, and his wife." John Smith, staggered in mind, went out of doors and looked over the garden gate to collect his ideas. He had not been there 2 minutes when wheels were heard, and a carriage and pair rolled along the road. A distinguished-looking lady, with the demeanour of a duchess, reclined within. When opposite Smith's gate, she turned her head and instantly commanded the coachman to stop. "Ah, Mr. Smith, I am glad to see you looking so well. I could not help stopping a moment to congratulate you and Mrs. Smith upon the happiness you must enjoy. Joseph, you may drive on." And the carriage rolled away towards St. Launce's. Out rushed Mrs. Smith from behind a laurel bush where she had stood pondering. "Just going to touch my hat to her," said John. "Just for all the world as I would have to poor Lady Luxellian years ago." "Lord, who is she?" "The public-house woman. What's her name? Mrs. at the Falcon." "Public-house woman. The clumsiness of the Smith family. You might have said the landlady of the Falcon Hotel, since we're in for politeness. The people are ridiculous enough, but give them their due." The possibility is that Mrs. Smith was getting mollified, in spite of herself, by these remarkably friendly phenomena among the people of St. Launce's, and in justice to them it was quite desirable that she should do so. The interest which the unpractised ones of this town expressed so grotesquely was genuine of its kind, and equal in intrinsic worth to the more polished smiles of larger communities. By this time Mr. and Mrs. Trewen were returning from the garden. "I'll ask him flat," whispered John to his wife. "I'll say, we be in a fog. You'll excuse my asking a question, Mr. and Mrs. Trewen. How is it you all be so friendly to-day? Hey? 'Twould sound right and sensible, wouldn't it?" "Not a word. Good mercy, when will the man have manners?" "It must be a proud moment for you, I'm sure, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, to have a son so celebrated," said the bank manager, advancing. "Ah, 'tis Stephen. I knew it," said Mrs. Smith triumphantly to herself. "We don't know particulars," said John. "Not know?" "No." "Why, 'tis all over town. Our worthy mayor alluded to it in his speech at the dinner last night of the Every Man his Own Maker Club." "And what about Stephen?" urged Mrs. Smith. "Why, your son has been feted by deputy governors and Parsee princes and nobody knows who in India. He's hand in glove with nabobs, and is to design a large palace and cathedral and hospitals, colleges, halls, and fortifications, by the general consent of the ruling powers, Christian and pagan alike." "'Twas sure to come to the boy," said Mr. Smith unassumingly. "'Tis in yesterday's St. Launce's Chronicle, and our worthy mayor in the chair introduced the subject into his speech last night in a masterly manner." "'Twas very good of the worthy mayor in the chair, I'm sure," said Stephen's mother. "I hope the boy will have the sense to keep what he's got. But as for men, they are a simple sex. Some woman will hook him." "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the evening closes in, and we must be going. And remember this, that every Saturday when you come into market, you are to make our house as your own. There'll always be a cup of tea and saucer for you, as you know there has been for months, though you may have forgotten it. I'm a plain speaking woman, and what I say I mean." When the visitors were gone, and the sun had set, and the moon's rays were just beginning to assert themselves upon the walls of the dwelling, John Smith and his wife sat down to the newspaper they had hastily procured from the town, and when the reading was done, they considered how best to meet the new social requirements settling upon them, which Mrs. Smith considered could be done by new furniture and house enlargement alone. "And John, mind one thing," she said in conclusion. "In writing to Stephen, never by any means mention the name of Elfride Swancourt again. We've left the place, and know no more about her except by hearsay. He seems to be getting free of her, and I'm glad for it. It was a cloudy hour for him when he first set eyes upon the girl. That family's been no good to him, first or last, so let 'em keep their blood to themselves if they want to. He thinks of her, I know, but not so hopelessly. So don't try to know anything about her, and we can't answer his questions." A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 37. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 37. After Many Days. Knight roamed south under colour of studying continental antiquities. He paced the lofty aisles of Amiens, loitered by Ardennes Abbey, climbed into the strange towers of Laon, analysed Noyon and Rheims. Then he went to Chartres and examined its scaly spires and quaint carving. Then he idled about Coutances. He rode beneath the base of Mont Saint Michel, and caught the varied skyline of the crumbling edifices encrusting it. St. Ouen, Rouen knew him for days. So did Vézelay, Sens, and many a hallowed monument besides. Abandoning the inspection of early French art with the same purposeless haste
as he is shown in undertaking it, he went further, and lingered about Ferrara, Padua, and Pisa. Satiated with medievalism, he tried the Roman Forum. Next he observed moonlight and starlight effects by the Bay of Naples. He turned to Austria, became enervated and depressed on Hungarian and Bohemian plains, and was refreshed again by breezes on the declivities of the Carpathians. Then he found himself in Greece. He visited the plain of Marathon, and strove to imagine the Persian defeat, to Mars Hill, to picture St. Paul addressing the ancient Athenians, to Thermopylae and Salamis, to run through the facts and traditions of the second invasion, the result of his endeavours being more or less chaotic. Knight grew as weary of these places as of all others. Then he felt the shock of an earthquake in the Ionian Islands, and went to Venice. Here he shot in gondolas up and down the winding thoroughfare of the Grand Canal, and loitered on Calais and Piazza at night, when the lagunes were undisturbed by a ripple, and no sound was to be heard but the stroke of the midnight clock. Afterwards he remained for weeks in the museums, galleries, and libraries of Vienna, Berlin, and Paris, and thence came home. Time thus rolls us on to a February afternoon, divided by 15 months from the parting of Elfride and her lover in the brown stubble field toward the sea. Two men, obviously not Londoners, and with a touch of foreignness in their look, met by accident on one of the gravel walks leading across Hyde Park. The younger, more given to looking about him than his fellow, saw and noticed the approach of his senior some time before the latter had raised his eyes from the ground, upon which they were bent in an abstracted gaze that seemed habitual with him. "Mr. Knight! Indeed it is!" exclaimed the younger man. "Ah, Stephen Smith," said Knight. Simultaneous operations might now have been observed progressing in both, the result being that an expression less frank and impulsive than the first took possession of their features. It was manifest that the next words uttered were a superficial covering to constraint on both sides. "Have you been in England long?" said Knight. "Only 2 days," said Smith. "India ever since?" "Nearly ever since." "They were making a fuss of you at St. Launce's last year. I fancy I saw something of that sort in the papers." "Yes, I believe something was said about me." "I must congratulate you on your achievements." "Thanks, but they are nothing very extraordinary. A natural professional progress where there was no opposition." There followed that want of words which will always assert itself between nominal friends who find that they have ceased to be real ones, and have not yet sunk to the level of mere acquaintance. Each looked up and down the park. Knight may possibly have borne in mind during the intervening months Stephen's manner towards him the last time they had met, and may have encouraged his former interest in Stephen's welfare to die out of him as misplaced. Stephen certainly was full of the feelings begotten by the belief that Knight had taken away the woman he loved so well. Stephen Smith then asked a question, adopting a certain recklessness of manner and tone to hide, if possible, the fact that the subject was a much greater one to him than his friend had ever supposed. "Are you married?" "I am not." Knight spoke in an indescribable tone of bitterness that was almost moroseness. "And I never shall be," he added decisively. "Are you?" "No," said Stephen, sadly and quietly, like a man in a sick room. Totally ignorant whether or not Knight knew of his own previous claims upon Elfride, he yet resolved to hazard a few more words upon the topic, which had an aching fascination for him even now. "Then your engagement to Miss Swancourt came to nothing?" he said. "You remember I met you with her once." Stephen's voice gave way a little here, in defiance of his firmest will to the contrary. Indian affairs had not yet lowered those emotions down to the point of control. "It was broken off," came quickly from Knight. "Engagements to marry often end like that, for better or for worse."
Yes, so they do. And what have you been doing lately?
Doing? Oh, nothing.
Where have you been?
I can hardly tell you. In the main, going about Europe. And it may perhaps interest you to know that I have been attempting the serious study of continental art of the Middle Ages. My notes on each example I visited are at your service. They are of no use to me.
I shall be glad with them. Oh, travelling far and near.
Not far, said Knight, with moody carelessness. You know, I dare say that sheep occasionally become giddy. Hydatis in the head, 'tis called, in which their brains become eaten up. And the animal exhibits the strange peculiarity of walking round and round in a circle continually. I have travelled just in the same way, round and round, like a giddy ram.
The reckless, bitter, and rambling style in which Knight talked, as if rather to vent his images than to convey any ideas to Stephen, struck the young man painfully. His former friend's days had become cankered in some way. Knight was a changed man.
He himself had changed much, but not as Knight had changed. Yesterday I came home, continued Knight, without having, to the best of my belief, imbibed a half-dozen ideas worth retaining.
You out-Hamlet in morbidness of mood, said Stephen with regretful frankness.
Knight made no reply.
Do you know, Stephen continued, I could almost have sworn that you would be married before this time, from what I saw. Knight's face grew harder.
Could you? He said.
Stephen was powerless to forsake the depressing, luring subject. Yes, and I simply wonder at it.
Whom did you expect me to marry?
Her I saw you with.
Thank you for that wonder.
Did she jilt you?
Smith, now one word to you, Knight returned steadily. Don't you ever question me on that subject. I have a reason for making this request, mind, and if you do question me, you will not get an answer.
Oh, I don't for a moment wish to ask what is unpleasant to you, not I. I had a momentary feeling that I should like to explain something on my side, and hear a similar explanation on yours. But let it go, by all means.
What would you explain?
I lost the woman I was going to marry. You have not married as you intended. We might have compared notes.
I have never asked you a word about your case.
I know that.
And the inference is obvious.
Quite so.
The truth is, Stephen, I have doggedly resolved never to allude to the matter, for which I have a very good reason.
Doubtless, as good a reason as you had for not marrying her.
You talk insidiously. I had a good one, a miserably good one.
Smith's anxiety urged him to venture one more question. Did she not love you enough? He drew his breath in a slow and attenuated stream as he waited in timorous hope for the answer.
Stephen, you rather strain ordinary courtesy in pressing questions of that kind after what I have said. I cannot understand you at all. I must go on now.
Why, good God! exclaimed Stephen passionately. You talk as if you hadn't at all taken her away from anybody who had better claims to her than you.
What do you mean by that? Said Knight with a puzzled air. What have you heard?
Nothing. I too must go on. Good day.
If you will go, said Knight reluctantly now. You must, I suppose. I am sure I cannot understand why you behave so.
Nor I why you do. I have always been grateful to you, and as far as I am concerned we need never have become so estranged as we have.
And have I ever been anything but well disposed towards you, Stephen? Surely you know that I have not. The system of reserve began with you. You know that.
No, you altogether mistake our position. You were always from the first reserved to me, though I was confidential to you. That was, I suppose, the natural issue of our differing positions in life. And when I, the pupil, became reserved like you, the master, you did not like it. However, I was going to ask you to come round and see me.
Where are you staying?
At the Grosvenor Hotel, Pimlico.
So am I.
That's convenient, not to say odd. Well, I am detained in London for a day or two, then I am going down to see my father and mother, who live at St. Launce's now. Will you see me this evening?' 'I may, but I will not promise. A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 38. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 38. Jealousy is cruel as the grave. Stephen pondered not a little on his meeting with his old friend and once beloved exemplar. He was grieved, for amid all the distractions of his latter years, a still small voice of fidelity to Knight had lingered on in him. Perhaps his staunchness was because Knight had ever treated him as a mere disciple, even to snubbing him sometimes, and had at last, though unwittingly, inflicted upon him the greatest snub of all, that of taking away his sweetheart. The emotional side of his constitution was built rather after a feminine than a male model, and that tremendous wound from Knight's hand may have tended to keep alive a warmth which solicitousness would have extinguished altogether. Knight, on his part, was vexed, after they had parted, that he had not taken Stephen in hand a little after the old manner. Those words which Smith had let fall concerning somebody having a prior claim to Elfride would, if uttered when the man was younger, have provoked such a query as, 'Come, tell me all about it, my lad,' from Knight, and Stephen would straightway have delivered himself of all he knew on the subject. Stephen, the ingenuous boy, though now obliterated externally by Stephen the contriving man, returned to Knight's memory vividly that afternoon. He was at present but a sojourner in London, and after attending to the 2 or 3 matters of business which remained to be done that day, he walked abstractedly into the gloomy corridors of the British Museum for the half hour previous to their closing. That meeting with Smith had reunited the present with the past, closing up the chasm of his absence from England as if it had never existed, until the final circumstances of his previous time of residence in London formed but a yesterday to the circumstances now. The conflict that then had raged in him concerning Elfride Swancourt revived, strengthened by its sleep. Indeed, in those many months of absence, though quelling the intention to make her his wife, he had never forgotten that she was the type of woman adapted to his nature, and instead of trying to obliterate thoughts of her altogether, he had grown to regard them as an infirmity it was necessary to tolerate. Knight returned to his hotel much earlier in the evening than he would have done in the ordinary course of things. He did not care to think whether this arose from a friendly wish to close the gap that had slowly been widening between himself and his earliest acquaintance, or from a hankering desire to hear the meaning of the dark oracles Stephen had hastily pronounced, betokening that he knew something more of Elfride than Knight had supposed. He made a hasty dinner, inquired for Smith, and soon was ushered into the young man's presence, whom he found sitting in front of a comfortable fire, beside a table spread with a few scientific periodicals and art reviews. 'I have come to see you after all,' said Knight. 'My manner was odd this morning, and it seemed desirable to call. But that you had too much sense to notice, Stephen, I know. I put it down to my wanderings in France and Italy.' 'Don't say another word, but sit down. I am only too glad to see you again.' Stephen would hardly have cared to tell Knight just then that the minute before Knight was announced he had been reading over some old letters of Elfride's. They were not many, and until to-night had been sealed up and stowed away in a corner of his leather trunk, with a few other mementos and relics which had accompanied him in his travels. The familiar sights and sounds of London, the meeting with his friend, had with him also revived that sense of abiding continuity with regard to Elfride, and love which his absence at the other side of the world had to some extent suspended, though never ruptured. He at first intended only to look over these letters on the outside. Then he read one, then another, until the whole was thus reused as a stimulus to sad memories. He folded them away again, placed them in his pocket, and instead of going on with an examination into the state of the artistic world, had remained musing on the strange circumstance that he had returned to find Knight not the husband of Elfride after all. The possibility of any given gratification begets a cumulative sense of its necessity. Stephen gave the rein to his imagination, and felt more intensely than he had felt for many months that without Elfride his life would never be any great pleasure to himself, or honour to his Maker. They sat by the fire, chatting on external and random subjects, neither caring to be the first to approach the matter each most longed to discuss. On the table with the periodicals lay 2 or 3 pocket books, one of them being open. Knight, seeing from the exposed page that the contents were sketches only, began turning the leaves over carelessly with his finger. When, some time later, Stephen was out of the room, Knight proceeded to pass the interval by looking at the sketches more carefully. The first crude ideas, pertaining to dwellings of all kinds, were roughly outlined on the different pages. Antiquities had been copied, fragments of Indian columns, colossal statues, and outlandish ornament from the temples of Elephanta and Kenari were carelessly intruded upon by outlines of modern doors, windows, roofs, cooking stoves, and household furniture. Everything, in short, which comes within the range of a practising architect's experience, who travels with his eyes open. Among these occasionally appeared rough delineations of medieval subjects for carving or illumination, heads of virgins, saints, and prophets. Stephen was not professedly a freehand draftsman, but he drew the human figure with correctness and skill. In its numerous repetitions on the sides and edges of the leaves, Knight began to notice a peculiarity. All the feminine saints had one type of feature. There were large nimbi and small nimbi about their drooping heads, but the face was always the same. That profile, how well Knight knew that profile! Had there been but one specimen of the familiar countenance, he might have passed over the resemblance as accidental, but a repetition meant more. Knight thought anew of Smith's hasty words earlier in the day, and looked at the sketches again and again. On the young man's entry, Knight said with palpable agitation, "Stephen, who are these intended for?" Stephen looked over the book with utter unconcern. "Saints and angels done in my leisure moments. They were intended as designs for the stained glass of an English church." "But whom do you idealize by that type of woman you always adopt for the Virgin?" "Nobody." Then a thought raced along Stephen's mind, and he looked up at his friend. The truth is, Stephen's introduction of Elfride's lineaments had been so unconscious that he had not at first understood his companion's drift. The hand, like the tongue, easily acquires the trick of repetition by rote, without calling in the mind to assist at all, and this had been the case here. Young men who cannot write verses about their loves generally take to portraying them, and in the early days of his attachment Stephen had never been weary of outlining Elfride. The lay figure of Stephen's sketches now initiated an adjustment of many things. Knight had recognized her. The opportunity of comparing notes had come unsought. "Elfride Swancourt, to whom I was engaged," he said quietly. "Stephen?" "I know what you mean by speaking like that." "Oh, was it Elfride? You, the man, Stephen?" "Yes. And you are thinking, why did I conceal the fact from you that time at Endelstow, are you not?" "Yes, and more. I did it for the best. Blame me if you will, I did it for the best. And now say, how could I be with you afterwards as I had been before?" "I don't know at all. I can't say." Knight remained fixed in thought, and once he murmured, "I had a suspicion this afternoon that there might be some such meaning in your words about my taking her away, but I dismissed it. How came you to know her?" he presently asked, in an almost peremptory tone. "I went down about the church years ago now." "Ah, when you were with Hewby. Of course, of course. Well, I can't understand it." His tones rose. "I don't know what to say. Your hoodwinking me like this for so long." "I don't see that I have hoodwinked you at all." "Yes, yes, but—" Knight arose from his seat and began pacing up and down the room. His face was markedly pale, and his voice perturbed, as he said, "You did not act as I should have acted towards you under these circumstances. I feel it deeply, and I tell you plainly I shall never forget it." "What?" "Your behaviour at that meeting in the family vault, when I told you we were going to be married. Deception, dishonesty everywhere, all the worlds of a piece." Stephen did not much like this misconstruction of his motives, even though it was but the hasty conclusion of a friend disturbed by emotion. "I could do no otherwise than I did, with due regard to her," he said stiffly. "Indeed," said Knight in the bitterest tone of reproach. "Nor could you, with due regard to her, have married her, I suppose. I have hoped, longed that he, who turns out to be you, would ultimately have done that." "I am much obliged to you for that hope, but you talk very mysteriously. I think I had about the best reason anybody could have had for not doing that." "Oh, what reason was it?" "That I could not." "You ought to have made an opportunity. You ought to do so now, and bear justice to her, Stephen," cried Knight, carried beyond himself. "That you know very well, and it hurts and wounds me more than you dream, to find you never have tried to make any reparation to a woman of that kind, so trusting, so apt to be run away with by her feelings. Poor little fool! So much the worse for her." "Why, you talk like a madman. You took her away from me, did you not?" "Picking up what another throws down can scarcely be called taking away. However, we shall not agree too well upon that subject, so we had better part." "But I am quite certain you misapprehend something most grievously," said Stephen, shaken to the bottom of his heart. "What have I done? Tell me. I have lost Elfride, but is that such a sin?" "Was it her doing, or yours?" "What's what?" "That you parted." "I will tell you honestly. It was hers entirely, entirely." "What was her reason?" "I can hardly say, but I will tell you the story without reserve." Stephen until to day had unhesitatingly held that she grew tired of him and turned to Knight, but he did not like to advance that statement now, or even to think the thought. To fancy otherwise accorded better with the hope to which Knight's estrangement had given birth, that love for his friend was not the direct cause, but a result of her suspension of love for himself. "Such a matter must not be allowed to breed discord between us," Knight returned, relapsing into a manner which concealed all his true feeling, as if confidence was now intolerable. "I do see that your reticence towards me in the vault may have been dictated by prudential considerations," he concluded artificially. "It was a strange thing altogether, but not of much importance, I suppose, at this distance of time, and it does not concern me now, though I don't mind hearing your story." These words from Knight, uttered with such an air of renunciation and apparent indifference, prompted Smith to speak on, perhaps with a little complacency, of his old secret engagement to Elfride. He told the details of its origin, and the peremptory words and actions of her father to extinguish their love. Knight persevered in the tone and manner of a disinterested outsider. It had become more than ever imperative to screen his emotions from Stephen's eye. The young man would otherwise be less frank, and their meeting would be again embittered. What was the use of untoward candour? Stephen had now arrived at the point in his ingenuous narrative where he left the vicarage because of her father's manner. Knight's interest increased. Their love seemed so innocent and childlike thus far. "It is a nice point in casuistry," he observed, "to decide whether you were culpable or not in not telling Mr. Swancourt that your parishioners were friends of his." It is only human nature to hold your tongue under the circumstances. Well, what was the result of your dismissal by him?' 'That we agreed to be secretly faithful, and to ensure this we thought we would marry.' Knight's suspense and agitation rose higher when Stephen entered upon this phase of the subject. 'Do you mind telling on?' he said, steadying his manner of speech. 'Oh, not at all.' Then Stephen gave in full the particulars of the meeting with Elfride at the railway station, the necessity they were under of going to London unless the ceremony were to be postponed, the long journey of the afternoon and evening, her timidity and revulsion of feeling, its culmination on reaching London, the crossing over to the down platform, and their immediate departure again, solely in obedience to her wish. The journey all night, their anxious watching for the dawn, their arrival at St. Launce's at last, were detailed. And he told how a village woman named Jethway was the only person who recognized him, either going or coming, and how dreadfully this terrified Elfride. He told how he waited in the fields whilst this then reproachful sweetheart went for her pony, and how the last kiss he ever gave her was given a mile out of the town, on the way to Endelstow. These things Stephen related with a will. He believed that in doing so he established word by word the reasonableness of his claim to Elfride. 'Curse her! Curse that woman! That miserable letter that parted us! O God!' Knight began pacing the room again, and uttered this at further end. 'What did you say?' said Stephen, turning round. 'Say? Did I say anything? Oh, I was merely thinking about your story, and the oddness of my having a fancy for the same woman afterwards, and that now I have forgotten her almost, and neither of us care about her, except just as a friend, you know, eh?' Knight still continued at the further end of the room, somewhat in shadow. 'Exactly,' said Stephen, inwardly exultant, for he was really deceived by Knight's off-hand manner. Yet he was deceived less by the completeness of Knight's disguise than by the persuasive power which lay in the fact that Knight had never before deceived him in anything. So this supposition that his companion had ceased to love Elfride was an enormous lightening of the weight which had turned the scale against him. 'Admitting that Elfride could love another man after you,' said the elder under the same varnish of careless criticism, 'she was none the worse for that experience.' 'The worse? Of course she was none the worse.' 'Did you ever think it a wild, thoughtless thing for her to do?' 'Indeed, I never did,' said Stephen. 'I persuaded her. She saw no harm in it till she decided to return, nor did I. Nor was there, except to the extent of indiscretion.' 'Directly she thought it was wrong she would go no further?' 'That was it. I had just begun to think it wrong too.' 'Such a childish escapade might have been misrepresented by any evil-disposed person, might it not?' 'It might, but I never heard that it was. Nobody who really knew all the circumstances would have done otherwise than smile. If all the world had known it, Elfride would still have remained the only one who thought her action a sin. Poor child! She always persisted in thinking so, and was frightened more than enough.' 'Stephen, do you love her now?' 'Well, I like her. I always shall, you know,' he said evasively, and with all the strategy love suggested. 'But I have not seen her for so long that I can hardly be expected to love her. Do you love her still?' 'How shall I answer without being ashamed? What fickle beings we men are, Stephen! Men may love strongest for a while, but women love longest. I used to love her, in my way, you know.' 'Yes, I understand. Ah, and I used to love her in my way. In fact, I loved her a good deal at one time, but travel has a tendency to obliterate early fancies.' 'It has truly.' Perhaps the most extraordinary feature in this conversation was the circumstance that, though each interlocutor had at first his suspicions of the other's abiding passion awakened by several little acts, Neither would allow himself to see that his friend might now be speaking deceitfully as well as he. "Stephen," resumed Knight, "now that matters are smooth between us, I think I must leave you. You won't mind my hurrying off to my quarters? You'll stay to some sort of supper, surely? Didn't you come to dinner?" "You must really excuse me this once." "Then you'll drop in to breakfast to morrow?" "I shall be rather pressed for time." "An early breakfast, which shall interfere with nothing?" "I'll come," said Knight, with as much readiness as it would be possible to graft upon a huge stock of reluctance. "Yes, early. 8 o'clock, say, as we are under the same roof." "Any time you like. 8 it shall be." And Knight left him. To wear a mask, to dissemble his feelings as he had in their late miserable conversation, was such torture that he could no longer support it. It was the first time in Knight's life that he had ever been so entirely the player of a part, and the man he had thus deceived was Stephen, who had docilely looked up to him from youth as a superior of unblemished integrity. He went to bed, and allowed the fever of his excitement to rage uncontrolled. Stephen! It was only he who was the rival. Only Stephen. There was an anticlimax of absurdity which Knight, wretched and conscience-stricken as he was, could not help recognizing. Stephen was but a boy to him. Where the great grief lay was in perceiving that the very innocence of Elfride in reading her little fault as one so grave was what had fatally misled him. Had Elfride, with any degree of coolness, asserted that she had done no harm, the poisonous breath of the dead Mrs. Jethway would have been inoperative. Why did he not make his little docile girl tell more? If on that subject he had only exercised the imperativeness customary with him on others, all might have been revealed. It smote his heart like a switch when he remembered how gently she had borne his scourging speeches, never answering him with a single reproach, only assuring him of her unbounded love. Knight blessed Elfride for her sweetness, and forgot her fault. He pictured with a vivid fancy those fair summer scenes with her. He again saw her as at their first meeting, timid at speaking, yet in her eagerness to be explanatory borne forward almost against her will. How she would wait for him in green places, without showing any of the ordinary womanly affectations of indifference. How proud she was to be seen walking with him, bearing legibly in her eyes the thought that he was the greatest genius in the world. He formed a resolution, and after that could make pretence of slumber no longer. Rising and dressing himself, he sat down and waited for day. That night Stephen was restless too, not because of the unwontedness of a return to English scenery, not because he was about to meet his parents and settle down for a while to English cottage life. He was indulging in dreams, and for the nonce the warehouses of Bombay and the plains and forts of Poona were but a shadow's shadow. His dream was based on this one atom of fact: Elfride and Knight had become separated, and their engagement was as if it had never been. Their rupture must have occurred soon after Stephen's discovery of the fact of their union, and Stephen went on to think, what so probable as that a return of her errant affection to him was the cause. Stephen's opinions in the matter were those of a lover, and not the balanced judgment of an unbiassed spectator. His naturally sanguine spirit built hope upon hope, till scarcely a doubt remained in his mind that her lingering tenderness for him had in some way been perceived by Knight, and had provoked their parting. To go and see Elfride was a suggestion of impulses it was impossible to withstand. At any rate, to run down from St. Launce's to Castle Boterel, a distance of less than 20 miles, and glide like a ghost about their old haunts, making stealthy inquiries about her, would be a fascinating way of passing the first spare hours after reaching home on the day after the morrow. He was now a richer man than heretofore, standing on his own bottom, and the definite position in which he had rooted himself nullified old local distinctions. He had become illustrious, pair of blue eyes, Chapter 39. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 39. Each to the loved one's side. The friends and rivals breakfasted together the next morning. Not a word was said on either side upon the matter discussed the previous evening so glibly and so hollowly. Stephen was absorbed the greater part of the time in wishing he were not forced to stay in town yet another day. "I don't intend to leave for St. Launce's till to-morrow, as you know," he said to Knight at the end of the meal. "What are you going to do with yourself to-day?" "I have an engagement just before 10, said Knight deliberately, "and after that time I must call upon 2 or 3 people." "I'll look for you this evening," said Stephen. "Yes, do. You may as well come up and dine with me. That is, if we can meet. I may not sleep in London to-night. In fact, I am absolutely unsettled as to my movements yet. However, the first thing I am going to do is get my baggage shifted from this place to Bede's Inn. Good-bye for the present. I'll write to you, you know, if I can't meet you." It now wanted 8:45 o'clock. When Knight was gone, Stephen felt yet more impatient of the circumstance that another day would have to drag itself away wearily before he could set out for that spot of earth whereon a soft thought of him might perhaps be nourished still. On a sudden he admitted to his mind the possibility that the engagement he was waiting in town to keep might be postponed without much harm. It was no sooner perceived than attempted. Looking at his watch, he found it wanted 40 minutes to the departure of the 10 o'clock train from Paddington, which left him with a surplus quarter of an hour before it would be necessary to start for the station. Scribbling a hasty note or two, one putting off the business meeting, another to Knight, apologizing for not being able to see him in the evening, paying his bill, and leaving his heavier luggage to follow him by goods train, he jumped into a cab and rattled off to the Great Western Station. Shortly afterwards he took his seat in the railway carriage. The guard paused on his whistle to let into the next compartment to Smith's a man of whom Stephen had caught but a hasty glimpse as he ran across the platform at the last moment. Smith sank back into the carriage, stilled by perplexity. The man was like Knight, astonishingly like him. Was it possible it could be he? To have got there he must have driven like the wind to Bede's Inn, and hardly have alighted before starting again. No, it could not be he. That was not his way of doing things. During the early part of the journey, Stephen Smith's thoughts busied themselves till his brain seemed swollen. One subject was concerning his own approaching actions. He was a day earlier than his letter to his parents had stated, and his arrangement with them had been that they should meet him at Plymouth, a plan which pleased the worthy couple beyond expression. Once before the same engagement had been made, which he had then quashed by antedating his arrival. This time he would go right on to Castle Boterel, ramble in that well-known neighbourhood during the evening and next morning, making inquiries, and return to Plymouth to meet them as arranged, a contrivance which would leave their cherished project undisturbed, relieving his own impatience also. At Chippenham there was a little waiting, and some loosening and attaching of carriages. Stephen looked out. At the same moment another man's head emerged from the adjoining window. Each looked in the other's face. Knight and Stephen confronted one another. "You here?" said the younger man. "Yes, it seems that you are too," said Knight strangely. "Yes." The selfishness of love and the cruelty of jealousy were fairly exemplified at this moment. Each of the two men looked at his friend as he had never looked at him before. Each was troubled at the other's presence. "I thought you said you were not coming till to-morrow,"
remarked Knight. I did. It was an afterthought to come to-day. This journey was your engagement, then? No, it was not. This is an afterthought of mine, too. I left a note to explain it and account for my not being able to meet you this evening as we arranged. So did I for you. You don't look well. You did not this morning. I have a headache. You are paler to-day than you were. I, too, have been suffering from headache. We have to wait here a few minutes, I think. They walked up and down the platform, each one more and more embarrassingly concerned with the awkwardness of his friend's presence. They reached the end of the footway and paused in sheer absent-mindedness. Stephen's vacant eyes rested upon the operations of some porters who were shifting a dark and curious-looking van from the rear of the train to shunt another which was between it and the fore part of the train. This operation having been concluded, the two friends returned to the side of their carriage. "Will you come in here?" said Knight, not very warmly. "I have my rug and portmanteau and umbrella with me. It is rather bothering to move now," said Stephen reluctantly. "Why not you come here?" "I have my traps too. It is hardly worth while to shift them, for I shall see you again, you know." "Oh, yes." And each got into his own place. Just at starting, a man on the platform held up his hands and stopped the train. Stephen looked out to see what was the matter. One of the officials was exclaiming to another, "That carriage should have been attached again. Can't you see it's for the main line? Quick! What fools there are in the world!" "What a confounded nuisance these stoppages are!" exclaimed Knight impatiently, looking out from his compartment. What is it?" "That singular carriage we saw has been unfastened from our train by mistake, it seems," said Stephen. He was watching the process of attaching it. The van or carriage, which he now recognized as having seen at Paddington before they started, was rich and solemn rather than gloomy in aspect. It seemed to be quite new and of modern design, and its impressive personality attracted the notice of others beside himself. He beheld it gradually wheeled forward by two men on each side, slower and more sadly it seemed to approach. Then a slight concussion, and they were connected with it, and off again. Stephen sat all the afternoon pondering upon the reason of Knight's unexpected reappearance. Was he going as far as Castle Boterel? If so, he could only have one object in view, a visit to Elfride. And what an idea it seemed! At Plymouth, Smith partook of a little refreshment, and then went round to the side from which the train started for Camelton, the new station near Castle Boterel and Endelstow. Knight was already there. Stephen walked up and stood beside him without speaking. Two men at this moment crept out from among the wheels of the waiting train. "The carriage is light enough," said one in a grim tone. "Light as vanity, full of nothing." "Nothing in size, but a good deal in signification," said the other, a man of brighter mind and manners. Smith then perceived that to their train was attached the same carriage of grand and dark aspect which had haunted them all the way from London. "You are going on, I suppose?" said Knight, turning to Stephen, after idly looking at the same object. "Yes." "We may as well travel together for the remaining distance, may we not?" "Certainly we will." And they both entered the same door. Evening drew on apace. It chanced to be the eve of St. Valentine's, that bishop of blessed memory to youthful lovers, and the sun shone low under the rim of a thick hard cloud, decorating the eminences of the landscape with crowns of orange fire. As the train changed its direction on a curve, the same rays stretched in through the window and coaxed open Knight's half-closed eyes. "You'll get out at St. Launce's, I suppose?" he murmured. "No," said Stephen. "I am not expected till to-morrow."
Knight was silent. 'And you, are you going to Endelstow?' said the younger man pointedly. 'Since you ask, I can do no less than say I am, Stephen,' continued Knight slowly, and with more resolution of manner than he had shown all the day. 'I am going to Endelstow to see if Elfride Swancourt is still free, and if so, to ask her to be my wife.' 'So am I,' said Stephen Smith. 'I think you'll lose your labour,' Knight returned with decision. 'Naturally you do.' There was a strong accent of bitterness in Stephen's voice. 'You might have said hope instead of think,' he added. 'I might have done no such thing. I gave you my opinion. Elfride Swancourt may have loved you once, no doubt, but it was when she was so young that she hardly knew her mind.' 'Thank you,' said Stephen laconically. 'She knew her mind as well as I did. We are the same age. If you hadn't interfered—' 'Don't say that. Don't say it, Stephen. How can you make out that I interfered? Be just, please.' 'Well,' said his friend, 'she was mine before she was yours. You know that. And it seemed a hard thing to find that you had got her, and that if it had not been for you, all might have turned out well for me.' Stephen spoke with a swelling heart, and looked out of the window to hide the emotion that would make itself visible upon his face. 'That is absurd,' said Knight in a kinder tone, 'for you to look at the matter in that light. What I tell you is for your own good. You naturally do not like to realize the truth, that her liking for you was only a girl's first fancy, which has no root ever.' 'It is not true,' said Stephen passionately. 'It was you put me out, and now you'll be pushing in again between us, and depriving me of my chance again. My right, that's what it is. How ungenerous of you to come anew and try to take her away from me. When you had won her, I did not interfere, and you might, I think, Mr. Knight, do by me as I did by you.' 'Don't "Mr." me. You are as well in the world as I am now.' 'First love is deepest, and that was mine.' 'Who told you that?' said Knight superciliously. 'I had her first love. And it was through me that you and she parted. I can guess that well enough.' 'It was. And if I were to explain to you in what way that operated in parting us, I should convince you that you do quite wrong in intruding upon her, that, as I said at first, your labour will be lost. I don't choose to explain, because the particulars are painful, but if you don't listen to me, go on, for heaven's sake. I don't care what you do, my boy.' 'You have no right to domineer over me as you do, just because when I was a lad I was accustomed to look up to you as a master, and you helped me a little, for which I was grateful to you, and have loved you. You assume too much now, and step in before me. It is cruel, it is unjust, of you to injure me so.' Knight showed himself keenly hurt at this. 'Stephen, those words are untrue and unworthy of any man, and they are unworthy of you. You know you wrong me. If you have ever profited by any instruction of mine, I am only too glad to know it. You know it was given ungrudgingly, and that I have never once looked upon it as making you in any way a debtor to me.' Stephen's naturally gentle nature was touched, and it was in a troubled voice that he said, 'Yes, yes, I am unjust in that, I own it.' 'This is St. Launce's station, I think. Are you going to get out?' Knight's manner of returning to the matter in hand drew Stephen again into himself. 'No, I told you I was going to Endelstow,' he resolutely replied. Knight's features became impassive, and he said no more. The train continued rattling on, and Stephen leant back in his corner and closed his eyes. The yellows of evening had turned to browns, the dusky shades thickened, and a flying cloud of dust occasionally stroked the window, borne upon a chilling breeze which blew from the north east. The previously gilded but now dreary hills began to lose their daylight aspects of rotundity, and to become black discs vandyked against the sky, all nature wearing the cloak that 6 o'clock casts over the landscape at this time of the year. Stephen started up in bewilderment after a long stillness, and it was some time before he recollected himself. "Well, how real! How real!" he exclaimed, brushing his hand across his eyes. "What is?" said Knight. "That dream. I fell asleep for a few minutes, and have had a dream, the most vivid I ever remember." He wearily looked out into the gloom. They were now drawing near to Camelton. The lighting of the lamps was perceptible through the veil of evening, each flame starting into existence at intervals, and blinking weakly against the gusts of wind. "Well, what did you dream?" said Knight moodily. "Oh, nothing to be told. It was a sort of incubus. There is never anything in dreams." "I hardly supposed there was." "I know that. However, what I so vividly dreamt was this, since you would like to hear. It was the brightest of bright mornings at East Endelstow Church, and you and I stood by the font. Far away in the chancel Lord Luxellian was standing alone, cold and impassive, and utterly unlike his usual self. But I knew it was he. Inside the altar rail stood a strange clergyman with his book open. He looked up and said to Lord Luxellian, 'Where is the bride?' Lord Luxellian said, 'There is no bride.' At that moment somebody came in at the door, and I knew her to be Lady Luxellian, who died. He turned and said to her, 'I thought you were in the vault below us, but that could have only been a dream of mine. Come on.' Then she came on, and in brushing between us she chilled me so with cold that I exclaimed, 'The life is gone out of me!' And in the way of dreams I awoke. But here we are at Camelton." They were slowly entering the station. "What are you going to do?" said Knight. "Do you really intend to call on the Swancourts?" "By no means. I am going to make inquiries first. I shall stay at the Luxellian Arms to night. You will go right on to Endelstow, I suppose, at once." "I can hardly do that at this time of day. Perhaps you are not aware that the family, her father at any rate, is at variance with me as much as with you." "I didn't know it." "And that I cannot rush into the house as an old friend any more than you can. Certainly I have the privileges of a distant relationship, whatever they may be." Knight let down the window and looked ahead. "There are a great many people at the station," he said. "They seem all to be on the look out for us." When the train stopped, the half estranged friends could perceive by the lamplight that the assemblage of idlers enclosed as a kernel a group of men in black cloaks. A side gate in the platform railing was open, and outside this stood a dark vehicle, which they could not at first characterize. Then Knight saw on its upper part forms against the sky like cedars by night, and knew the vehicle to be a hearse. Few people were at the carriage doors to meet the passengers. The majority had congregated at this upper end. Knight and Stephen alighted, and turned for a moment in the same direction. The sombre van, which had accompanied them all day from London, now began to reveal that their destination was also its own. It had been drawn up exactly opposite the open gate. The bystanders all fell back, forming a clear lane from the gateway to the van, and the men in cloaks entered the latter conveyance. "They are labourers, I fancy," said Stephen. "Ah, it is strange, but I recognize 3 of them as Endelstow men. Rather remarkable, this." Presently they began to come out, 2 and 2, and under the rays of the lamp they were seen to bear between them a light-coloured coffin of satin wood, brightly polished and without a nail. The 8 men took the burden upon their shoulders, and slowly crossed with it over to the gate. Knight and Stephen went outside, and came close to the procession as it moved off. A carriage belonging to the cortege turned round close to a lamp. The rays shone upon the face of the vicar of Endelstow, Mr. Swancourt, looking many years older than when they had seen him last. Stephen and Knight involuntarily drew back. Knight spoke to a bystander. "What has Mr. Swancourt to do with that funeral?" "He is the lady's father," said the bystander. "What lady's father?" said Knight, in a voice so hollow that the man stared at him. "The father of the lady in the coffin. She died in London, you know, and she's been brought here by this train. She's to be taken home to-night and buried to-morrow." Knight stood staring blindly at where the hearse had been, as if he saw it or some one there. Then he turned and beheld the lithe form of Stephen, bowed down. A Pair of Blue Eyes, Chapter 40. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy, Chapter 40. Welcome, proud lady. Half an hour has passed. Two miserable men are wandering in the darkness up the miles of road from Camelton to Endelstow. "Has she broken her heart?" said Henry Knight. "Can it be that I have killed her? I was bitter with her, Stephen, and she has died, and may God have no mercy upon me." "How can you have killed her more than I?" "Why, I went away from her, stole away almost, and didn't tell her I should not come again. And at that last meeting I did not kiss her once, but let her miserably go. I have been a fool, a fool. I wish the most abject confession of it before crowds of my countrymen could in any way make amends to my darling for the intense cruelty I have shown her." "Your darling?" said Stephen, with a sort of laugh. "Any man can say that, I suppose. Any man can. I know this. She was my darling before she was yours, and after too. If anybody has a right to call her his own, it is I." "You talk like a man in the dark, which is what you are. Did she ever do anything for you? Risk her name, for instance, for you?" "Yes, she did," said Stephen emphatically. "Not entirely. Did she ever live for you? Prove she could not live without you? Laugh and weep for you?" "Yes." "Never. Did she ever risk her life for you? No. My darling did for me." "Then it was in kindness only. When did she risk her life for you?" "To save mine on the cliff yonder. The poor child was with me looking at the approach of the Puffin steamboat, and I slipped down. We both had a narrow escape. I wish we had died there." "Ah, but wait," Stephen pleaded with wet eyes. "She went on that cliff to see me arrive home. She had promised it. She told me she would months before. And would she have gone there had she not cared for me at all?" "You have an idea that Elfride died for you, no doubt," said Knight with a mournful sarcasm, too nerveless to support itself. "Never mind. If we find that she died yours, I'll say no more, ever." "And if we find she died yours, I'll say no more." "Very well. So it shall be." The dark clouds into which the sun had sunk had begun to drop rain in an increasing volume. "Can we wait somewhere till this shower is over?" said Stephen desultorily. "As you will, but it's not worth while. We'll hear the particulars and return. Don't let people know who we are. I am not much now." They had reached a point at which the road branched into two. Just outside the west village, one fork of the diverging routes passing into the latter place, the other stretching on to East Endelstow. Having come some of the distance by the footpath, they now found that the hearse was only a little in advance of them. "I fancy it has turned off to East Endelstow. Can you see?" "I cannot. You must be mistaken." Knight and Stephen entered the village. A bar of fiery light lay across the road, proceeding from the half-open door of a smithy,
in which bellows were heard blowing and a hammer ringing. The rain had increased, and they mechanically turned for shelter towards a warm and cosy scene. Close at their heels came another man, without overcoat or umbrella, and with a parcel under his arm. "A wet evening," he said to the two friends as he passed by them. They stood in the outer penthouse, but the man went into the fire. The smith ceased his blowing and began talking to the man who had entered. "I have walked all the way from Camelton," said the latter. "Was obliged to come to-night, you know." He held the parcel, which was a flat one, towards the firelight, to learn if the rain had penetrated it. Resting it edgewise on the forge, he supported it perpendicularly with one hand, wiping his face with the handkerchief he held in the other. "I suppose you know what I've got here?" he observed to the smith. "No, I don't," said the smith, pausing again on his bellows. "As the rain's not over, I'll show you," said the bearer. He laid the thin and broad package, which had acute angles in different directions, flat upon the anvil, and the smith blew up the fire to give him more light. First, after untying the package, a sheet of brown paper was removed. This was laid flat. Then he unfolded a piece of baize. This also he spread flat on the paper. The third covering was a wrapper of tissue paper, which was spread out in its turn. The enclosure was revealed, and he held it up for the smith's inspection. "Oh, I see," said the smith, kindling with a chastened interest, and drawing close. "Poor young lady. Ah, terrible melancholy thing. So soon, too." Knight and Stephen turned their heads and looked. "And what's that?" continued the smith. "That's the coronet. Beautifully finished, isn't it? Ah, that cost some money. 'Tis as fine a bit of metal work as ever I see, that 'tis. It came from the same people as the coffin, you know, but was not ready soon enough to be sent round to the house in London yesterday. I got to fix it on this very night." The carefully packed articles were a coffin plate and coronet. Knight and Stephen came forward. The undertaker's man, on seeing them look for the inscription, civilly turned it round towards them, and each read, almost at one moment, by the ruddy light of the coals: "Elfrida, wife of Spencer Hugo Luxellian, 15th Baron Luxellian, died February the 10th, 18—" They read it, and read it, and read it again, Stephen and Knight as if animated by one soul. Then Stephen put his hand upon Knight's arm, and they retired from the yellow glow, further, further, till the chill darkness enclosed around them, and the quiet sky asserted its presence overhead as a dim grey sheet of blank monotony. "Where shall we go?" said Stephen. "I don't know." A long silence ensued. "Elfrida married," said Stephen, then in a thin whisper, as if he feared to let the assertion loose on the world. "False," whispered Knight. "And dead. Denied us both. I hate false. I hate it." Knight made no answer. Nothing was heard by them now save the slow measurement of time by their beating pulses, the soft touch of the dribbling rain upon their clothes, and the low purr of the blacksmith's bellows hard by. "Shall we follow Elfrida any further?" Stephen said. "No, let us leave her alone. She is beyond our love, and let her be beyond our approach. Since we don't know half the reasons that made her do as she did, Stephen, how can we say, even now, that she was not pure and true in heart?" Knight's voice had now become mild and gentle as a child's. He went on: "Can we call her ambitious? No. Circumstance has, as usual, overpowered her purpose, fragile and delicate as she, liable to be overthrown in a moment by the coarse elements of accident. I know that's it. Don't you?" "It may be. It must be. Let us go on." They began to bend their steps towards Castle Boterel, whither they had sent their bags from Camelton. They wandered on in silence for many minutes. Stephen then paused, and lightly put his hand within Knight's arm. "I wonder how she came to die," he said in a broken whisper. Shall we return and learn a little more?' They turned back again, and entering Endelstow a second time, came to a door which was standing open. It was that of an inn called the Welcome Home, and the house appeared to have been recently repaired and entirely modernized. The name, too, was not that of the landlord as formerly, but Martin Cannister's. Knight and Smith entered. The inn was quite silent, and they followed the passage till they reached the kitchen, where a huge fire was burning, which roared up the chimney, and sent over the floor, ceiling, and newly whitened walls a glare so intense as to make the candle quite a secondary light. A woman in a white apron and black gown was standing there alone behind a cleanly scrubbed deal table. Stephen first, and Knight afterwards, recognized her as Unity, who had been parlour maid at the vicarage and young lady's maid at the Crags. 'Unity,' said Stephen softly, 'don't you know me?' She looked inquiringly a moment, and her face cleared up. 'Mr. Smith? Ah, that's it,' she said. 'And that's Mr. Knight. I beg you sit down. Perhaps you'll know that since I saw you last I've married Martin Cannister.' 'How long have you been married?' 'About 5 months. We were married the same day that my dear Miss Elfride became Lady Luxellian.' Tears appeared in Unity's eyes, and filled them, and fell down her cheek in spite of efforts to the contrary. The pain of the two men, in resolutely controlling themselves when thus exampled to admit relief of the same kind, was distressing. They both turned their backs and walked a few steps away. Then Unity said, 'Will you go into the parlour, gentlemen?' 'Let us stay here with her,' Knight whispered, and turning said, 'No, we will sit here. We want to rest and dry ourselves for a time, if you please.' That evening the sorrowing friends sat with their hostess beside a large fire, Knight in the recess formed by the chimney breast, where he was in shade, and by showing a little confidence they won hers, and she told them what they had stayed to hear, the latter history of poor Elfride. 'One day, after you, Mr. Knight, had left us for the last time, she was missed from the Crags, and her father went after her, and brought her home ill. Where she went to I never knew, but she was very unwell for weeks afterwards, and she said to me that she didn't care what became of her, and wished she could die. When she was better, I said she would live to be married yet, and then she said, "Yes, I'll do anything for the benefit of my family, so as to turn my useless life to some practical account." Well, it began like this about Lord Luxellian courting her. The first Lady Luxellian had died, and he was in great trouble because the little girls were left motherless. After a while they used to come and see her in their little black frocks, for they liked her as well, or better than their own mother, that's true. They used to call her Little Mamma. These children made her a shade livelier, but she was not the girl she had been, I could see that, and she grew thinner a good deal. Well, my lord got to ask the Swancourts oftener and oftener to dinner, nobody else of his acquaintance, and at last the vicar's family were backwards and forwards at all hours of the day. Well, people say the little girls asked their father to let Miss Elfride come and live with them, and that he said perhaps he would if they were good children. However, the time went on, and one day I said, "Miss Elfride, you don't look so well as you used to, and though nobody else seemed to notice it, I do." She laughed a little, and said, "I shall live to be married yet, as you told me." "Shall you, miss? I am glad to hear that," I said. "Whom do you think I'm going to be married to?" she said again. "Mr. Knight, I suppose," said I. "Oh!" she cried, and turned off so white, and afore I could get to her she had sunk down like a heap of clothes and fainted away. Well, then she came to herself after a time, and said, "Unity, now we'll go on with our conversation." "Better not to-day, miss," I said. "Yes, we will," she said. "Whom do you think I'm going to be married to?" "I don't know," I said this time. "Guess," she said. "'Tisn't my lord, is it?" says I. "Yes, 'tis," says she.
in a sick, wild way. "But he don't come courting much," said I. "Ah, you don't know," she said, and told me 'twas going to be in October. After that she freshened up a bit. Whether 'twas with the thought of getting away from the home or not, I don't know. For perhaps I may as well speak plainly, and tell you that her home was no home to her now. Her father was bitter to her and harsh upon her, and though Mrs. Swancourt was well enough in her way, 'twas a sort of cold politeness that was not worth much, and the little thing had a worrying time of it altogether. About a month before the wedding, she and my lord and the two children used to ride about together upon horseback, and a very pretty sight they were. And if you'll believe me, I never saw 'em once with her unless the children were with her too, which made the courting strange looking. Ay, and my lord is so handsome, you know, so that at last I think she rather liked him. And I have seen her smile and blush a bit at things he said. He wanted her the more because the children did, for everybody could see that she would be a most tender mother to them, and a friend and playmate too. And my lord is not only handsome, but a splendid courter, and up to all the ways o' it. So he made her the beautifullest presents. One I can mind, a lovely bracelet with diamonds and emeralds. Oh, how red her face came when she saw it. The old roses came back to her cheeks for a minute or two then. I helped dress her the day we both were married. It was the last service I did her, poor child. When she was ready, I ran upstairs and slipped my own wedding gown on, and away they went, and away went Martin and I. And no sooner had my lord or my lady been married than the parson married us. It was a very quiet pair of weddings. Hardly anybody knew it. Well, hope will hold its own in a young heart, if so be it can, and my lady freshened up a bit, for my lord was so handsome and so kind. "How came she to die, and away from home?" murmured Knight. "Don't you see, sir, she fell off again afore they'd been married long, and my lord took her abroad for a change of scene. They were coming home, and had got as far as London when she was taken very ill and couldn't be moved, and there she died." "Was he very fond of her?" "What, my lord? Oh, he was. Very fond of her." "Very, beyond everything. Not suddenly, but by slow degrees. 'Twas her nature to win people more when they knew her well. He'd have died for her, I believe. Poor my lord, he's heartbroken now." "The funeral is to-morrow?" "Yes. My husband is now at the vault with the masons, opening the steps and cleaning down the walls." The next day the two men walked up the familiar valley from Castle Boterel to East Endelstow Church, and when the funeral was over and every one had left the lawn-like churchyard, the pair went softly down the steps of the Luxellian vault, and under the low-groined arches they had beheld once before, lit up then as now. In the new niche of the crypt lay a rather new coffin, which had lost some of its lustre, and a newer coffin, still bright and untarnished in the slightest degree. Beside the latter was the dark form of a man, kneeling on the damp floor, his body flung across the coffin, his hands clasped, and his whole frame seemingly given up in utter abandonment to grief. He was still young, younger perhaps than Knight, and even now showed how graceful was his figure and symmetrical his build. He murmured a prayer half aloud, and was quite unconscious that two others were standing within a few yards of him. Knight and Stephen had advanced to where they once stood beside Elfride on the day all three had met there, before she had herself gone down into silence like her ancestors, and shut her bright blue eyes for ever. Not until then did they see the kneeling figure in the dim light. Knight instantly recognized the mourner as Lord Luxellian, the bereaved husband of Elfride. They felt themselves to be intruders. Knight pressed Stephen back, and they silently withdrew as they had entered. "Come away," he said in a broken voice. "We have no right to be there. Another stands before us, nearer to her than we." And side by side they both retraced their steps,